Note by Anata Amara. I uploaded this book before but only a few people saw it, so I'll redo it now. It's incredibly interesting and it demonstrates how many different facets and layers there are to this marvelous game we call physical reality, and more specifically the Ascension. Enjoy. No constellation in the night sky has rivaled the Pleiades for its impact upon the mind of man. Artists, poets, scientists, mythographers and prophets alike have not only cited the Pleiades as an inspiration to their work but as a key to understanding mankind and his/her relationship with the creative principles of existence. This book is the incredible story of a man who found himself taken to the Pleiades, where he was examined and instructed by intelligent life forms who appeared human. The Pleiadians proceeded to give him an education and indoctrination that would enable him to regain his health and attain an unparalleled understanding of electromagnetic science and its role in UFO technology. Encounter in the Pleiades blends the history of physics and ufology with the personal experiences of Preston Nichols and gives unprecedented insight into the technology of flying saucers and their accompanying phenomena. Never before has the complex subject of UFOs been explained in such a simple language that will be appreciated by the scientist and understood by the layman. Introduction, by Peter Moon. In 1986, Preston Nichols shocked and dismayed the United States intelligence community when he publicly announced to a group of approximately 300 people in Chicago his role in a secret black project, held on Long Island. Officially known as the Phoenix Project to intelligence and military circles, this activity has become colloquially known as the Montauk Project, named after the location of the project, which was at Montauk, New York, and is the subject of a popular book entitled The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time, by Preston Nichols with Peter Moon. This book, for which Mr. Nichols is most famous, chronicled major events which involved secret sciences such as weather control and mind control. Allegedly, these developments led to full-scale teleportation and materialization of objects, which in turn led to the harnessing of time itself. After publication of The Montauk Project, investigation continued in an effort to substantiate such claims. This ultimately resulted in two subsequent books, Montauk Revisited, and Pyramids of Montauk, which corroborate that something of a very irregular nature did occur at Montauk and does so to this day. There are still more people coming forward that will attest to the reality of such a project. Although Preston's research has been hailed by many and condemned by others, no one can deny that he possesses a mastery of electromagnetic technology and has been involved in covert government research. His professional opinions and advice are still sought after in these circles. It is one aspect of Preston's connections to the secret sector which is to be the subject of this book, the field of UFOs. Encounter in the Pleiades, an inside look at UFOs, is written in two parts. Part 1 is by Preston Nichols and concerns his intimate experiences with UFOs, aliens and their technology. It begins with Preston's personal encounters and how he boarded a UFO at the request of the military in an attempt to figure out how the vehicle was engineered. As the book continues, this secret is revealed in a step-by-step fashion that will leave you with a startling new look at reality and how UFOs function. Certain passages may get a little technical, but the language used is non-intimidating and easy to understand. There is plenty of adventure as well. The second part of this book is by myself, Peter Moon. I have served as Preston's ghostwriter for his first 3 books, and this work is our 4th collaboration together. Part 2 begins with my own ventures into the paranormal and how these inextricably linked me to Preston Nichols and the UFO phenomena. I conclude by digging into the mythology of the Pleiades and demonstrating how these stars serve as a gateway to anyone trying to understand the phenomena of inner and outer space. Encounter in the Pleiades, an inside look at UFOs, will take you on an unprecedented journey in consciousness into the inner realm of the UFO phenomena. After you read this book, you will never look at the subject of flying saucers in quite the same way. Happy reading. Chapter 1, UFOs, A General History. Unidentified flying objects or UFOs have been around in different forms ever since the dawn of man. Mysterious flying crafts are mentioned in old Sanskrit manuscripts as well as the Bible. There is Ezekiel's winged fire chariot in the Old Testament and a host of other descriptions if you wish to seek them out in ancient literature. They are nothing new to the experience of mankind, but an understanding as regards their precise nature certainly needs to be improved upon. That is the premise of this book. Modern-day ufology begins in a popular sense in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's sightings in the Northwest and the crash in Roswell, New Mexico. The Roswell crash is particularly well documented and has been reported on in different books and a cable television movie. Although these events were reported on in the common press, earlier sightings were not so well known. In this respect, modern ufology began at least in the 1930s. The earliest sighting I've personally been told of was in 1936. This date, by no coincidence, is when the military was conducting its first experiments with radar. They could for the first time look at an unidentified object in the sky and see by looking at the radar screen that it had actual substance and was not of an illusory nature. This was the first hard scientific proof. At that particular time period, UFOs were referred to as flying unknowns, but for some reason the abbreviation FU didn't stick. Modern rumors of UFO crashes started roughly in 1936 and continued right through World War II until the first documented crash at Roswell in 1947. Since that time period, crashes began to occur at a rate of about one every 3 or 4 months. This is why the Air Force began Project Blue Book, which was at least a 2-layered project. The first priority was for the Air Force to seek out and discover all information concerning UFO sightings and crashes. This came under the heading of military intelligence gathering. It vitally concerned the security of the nation. The second priority was to cover up the information and keep it out of the hands of potential enemies. This included keeping it out of the hands of the general public. In addition to keeping the information out of the public eye for national security reasons, there was another psychological concern. The military thought that a national panic might ensue which could have unknown and possibly disastrous consequences. The 1939 broadcast of War of the Worlds proved that masses of people could react quite badly to the news of aliens arriving on planet Earth. In that specific case, people across the state of New Jersey began to barricade, flee and just generally panic when a radio broadcast of H.G. Wells' famous book announced that the Martians had landed. This was neither a prank by the station nor from Orson Welles, who narrated the story. The broadcast was fully described beforehand as the reading of a famous book. There is an even deeper anthropological implication as to why the government is so concerned and easily upset over the subject of UFOs. If you talk to the average person on the street and ask them where God is, many will point to the sky and answer that God is up there. If a very advanced culture suddenly arrived in a spaceship, large portions of the population would more than likely begin to worship the people in the spaceships as angels and believe they were ambassadors from God. With all the different religious sects forming around these beings from the stars, the government would lose control. All in all, what may have started out as a valid political concern developed into a control issue. Many people would dispute that it was a control issue all along. In any case, publicly elected officials did not make the information known to the public, assuming they were even told about it in the first place. The information on UFOs thus became reserved only for a power elite. While this power elite may have various motivations for keeping things secret, it is obvious that leaks have occurred and that disinformation has been circulated so as to keep the public confused and manipulated. My information comes from my own experiences. I am a professional engineer and understand all aspects of radar. I have known people who grew up in the industry and have heard countless stories. Some of the stories I have heard could be considered leaks, and others are just information passed on by logical deduction. This is the background against which I will relay my story. I will start by telling my own personal experiences with UFOs, beginning with childhood. Chapter 2: UFO Encounters. My first paranormal experience was as a child of about 5 or 6 years old. I woke up and saw what I believed to be the face of God looking in the doorway at me. This face definitely did not belong to either of my parents. It was very light-skinned and was surrounded with long white hair. Although I encountered this face many times, I do not recall any other unusual experiences until I was in my teens. I still do not know if the face I perceived was directly related to my later involvement with UFOs. It was either in 1961 or 1962, at the age of 15 or 16, that I saw my first UFO. Just prior to that time period, my parents had built me a small red shack in the far corner of our backyard. I was an electronics nut and they wanted to get me and my toys out of the house. As I conducted my experiments, they claimed I was making some of the most blood-curdling noises they had ever heard. Of course, in those days I had not yet learned how to properly install the negative feedback of an audio amplifier. If it is done incorrectly, there is screaming and howling that sounds like a banshee. It took me a while to understand why. It turned out all I had to do to stop the squealing was to reverse the leads on the output transformers, but until I figured that out, the amplifier must have squealed for a week. By building me a shed, my folks let me continue my hobby but at the same time ensured that I was as far away from the house as possible. It was no time before I had the place filled with radio receivers and a couple of old television sets. I even had some test equipment that looked like it belonged in Marconi's laboratory. As I had more test equipment than all my other classmates put together, I figured I was having a good old time as a high school kid. While tinkering in my lab one night, I couldn't get anything on the radio receivers but a strange humming noise. It kept coming over my radio receivers. Suddenly, I lost all power and the lights went dark. I soon went outside and witnessed a glowing disc-shaped object about 200 feet off the ground hovering over my front yard. I estimated the width at 50 feet and the height to be maybe 20 feet. Its color was bright white. All of a sudden and at once, the disc passed right over my head and took off. It moved upward, then proceeded to make a few impossible maneuvers before going straight up again. I also noticed that the lights in my house and the entire neighborhood had been blacked out. After a while, the lights came back on. The next thing I noticed was my mother running out of the house. She was all excited and said, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" "Sure, Mom, I saw that." I answered. "Do you know what that was?" She said, "I don't know. It looked like a flying saucer to me." She told me that whatever it was had wiped out the television. I then told her that the radios in my shop had ceased to work as well. This particular experience was my first close encounter of the first kind. This is a popular term in ufology that refers to one seeing a UFO. A close encounter of the second kind is when you actually see the UFO land while being in the immediate vicinity. A close encounter of the third kind is when you are either taken aboard or have communication with aliens. Sometimes an abduction experience is referred to as a close encounter of the fourth kind. The UFO sighting in my backyard turned out to be the first of many. Around this general time period, early 1960s, there were a lot of UFO sightings around the area of Islip, the town on Long Island where I grew up and still live to this day. One day, which I recall to be in 1964, I was with a group of kids in high school. The next thing I knew, the school was emptying out with all the students running outside. Out on the ball field behind the school, there was a boomerang-shaped craft doing some sort of flying maneuvers. It was very odd and seemed to be only about 4 feet in diameter. I'm still not sure exactly what it was, but it suddenly took off. That was my second encounter with a UFO. Sightings occurred frequently when I entered Suffolk Community College in Selden. In fact, students all over campus witnessed UFOs en masse. As I was part of the electrical technology department and had a considerable knowledge of radio, I decided to make it a little more interesting and set up all sorts of spectrum analyzers, radio receivers, and cameras. This did the trick. One night we actually recorded film of UFOs in the sky. They were very clear pictures, and anyone who stayed up late at night with me was able to witness the sightings firsthand. This was all extracurricular activity and was not treated with security measures of any kind. Consequently, when I came in the next morning to take out the footage, I was disappointed to discover that all the film had been taken from the cameras. It turned out that someone at the college had reported our activity. The result was that we began to be scrutinized by some sort of government authority. When we obtained the pay dirt, they were quick to move in and confiscate our evidence. Despite the shortcomings of our filming efforts, I did make progress in another area. This period at the college was the first time I had the opportunity to analyze the electromagnetic waves or signatures that these saucer objects generate. What I learned from this research was how to recognize UFOs. These crafts make very distinctive interference on shortwave radios and also in the VHF and UHF bands. The spectrum displays usually looked like a hill. I learned to recognize them mainly by the sound that comes out of the speakers while in the AM detection mode when the AGC, automatic gain control, is turned off. They sound like a hum, buzz or a whistle under such conditions. There are also certain patterns in the background noise you can pick up. I became pretty good at recognizing them and now do it primarily by listening through headphones. All of this was very interesting but was strictly extracurricular to my schoolwork. As events developed, I ended up getting involved in other businesses and projects. Most notable was a rather bizarre anti-gravity project which ended in commercial failure and was abandoned after pressure was put on me. All in all, it wasn't until about 1974 that I would have another dramatic encounter with a UFO. Chapter 3: Aboard a UFO. During most of the 1970s, I was working for a major defense contractor on Long Island. It was in 1974 or 75 when my boss told me that I was selected to be part of a special crew that would be examining some foreign technology located at an unspecified U.S. Air Force base. I figured we were going to look at either Russian or Chinese technology and mentioned that I would be happy to go along. I was then soberly informed that the assignment was not voluntary. I had to go. There were 6 of us who boarded an airplane which flew out of Republic Field on Long Island. We flew for a while and then landed. Looking from the air, I figured that we were going to Ohio. As soon as we hit ground and before we could possibly disembark, the pilot taxied along the runway and immediately went into a hangar. We were then shuttled from the plane into the back of a van with no windows. After being driven around for 2 or 3 hours, we had no idea where we could possibly be. Eventually, the van stopped and the back doors were opened. We emerged into some sort of underground hangar that was entirely empty. There was no wind or any other descriptive features to this facility, only doors that opened and closed. From one opening, you could see a corridor. We were taken down this corridor and sent to security where we were given a security briefing. I have said that there were 6 of us in total. One was my boss, but neither he nor the others remember too much of what went on. The briefing was done by Air Force personnel who were easily distinguished by their uniforms. My boss engaged in some rather lengthy dialogues with them. Finally, after being briefed on various security factors, we were taken into another hangar where we saw a disc-shaped UFO. I looked at one of the Air Force personnel and said, "Hey, that's a UFO." The airman said, "Shish, we're not supposed to say things like that. It's a foreign aircraft." He then told us that we were visiting the Foreign Aircraft Technology Group. It was obviously a very clever use of language. The Air Force personnel representing the Foreign Aircraft Technology Group then proceeded to give us a grand tour of the UFO. From the outside, the craft was silver and looked just like a typical disc-shaped flying saucer. It appeared to be about 50 feet in diameter and 20 feet in height. There was also a dome on top that was maybe 15 feet wide. The entire craft stood on 3 legs that came out from the bottom. A ramp went up from the ground to a doorway on the edge of the craft. The most startling aspect of this flying saucer was apparent when I first went aboard. It was absolutely huge inside. The vessel was only 50 feet in diameter, yet we walked in one direction for what seemed to be 10 minutes. There was literally hundreds or thousands of feet of space. I couldn't explain it at the time. By today's knowledge, it is apparent that we had entered an artificial reality when boarding the ship. This aspect of a UFO is key to its construction and ability to travel from one location to another. It will be elaborated on later. Although I have said we were walking through an artificial reality, it was just as real as the environment or room you are sitting in now. The next point of interest I observed was that there were no controls anywhere to be seen. No buttons, levers or knobs. As we walked down the corridor from compartment to compartment, the lights would come on just before we arrived. I looked behind our path and noticed that the lights went off as we left an area. The lighting was very tightly controlled. As we continued to inspect the craft, one of the Air Force crew informed us that the saucer originally contained an odd atmosphere but that it had been retrofitted, so that the atmosphere was compatible with human beings. We eventually came to a compartment that was identified as the control room. The most prominent part of this area were 3 lounge chairs placed in the front. By lounge chairs, I mean exactly that. They were designed for reclining comfort. A group of smaller chairs were in the back. Our group was then informed that the lounge chairs contained all sorts of coils, wires and other items. It was quite apparent that when a person or creature was reclined in the lounge chair, it was designed to pick the thoughts right out of their head. Readers of the Montauk Project. Experiments in Time will note that this technology is hauntingly familiar to that of the Montauk chair. On the walls, in front of the lounge chairs, were 4 view screens. These were also connected to the operator's thought processes. Sitting in the chair, one could call up different maps, star charts, or photographs from outside the craft. Just by thinking the thought, one could view what was outside the craft in any direction. Behind the view screens there was another small room that had a huge cluster of rock crystals. Coils spiraled around the crystals which were connected at various points by wiring. The walls in this room were nothing but view screens. There were no windows here or in any other portion of the craft. We were then taken 1 level above the control area. This was the crew's living quarters. In addition to normal creature comforts, this level contained laboratories and a big medical facility. The laboratories contained large tables possibly used for experimentation upon humans. Down below the control room, at the very bottom of the saucer, there was one huge room filled with different rock clusters which were all interconnected with wires. Neither myself nor my coworkers recognized anything in the room except for the wiring, which was very neat. It appeared to be mostly gold, silver and platinum. We were told that it did not have much copper in it. Off this bigger rock room were 4 smaller rooms which connected to 4 hemispherical pods that sat below the center of the ship. Those pods each contained an assortment of what appeared to be antennas. The bottom section of the saucer was insulated from the rest of the craft and was surrounded by a huge coil. This coil was really just a lot of turns of heavy wire and was similar to a degaussing coil used for television sets. The huge coil was connected to the large group of crystals in the central room, which appeared to be the central core of energy. This is essentially how the ship was constructed. From the technology I observed, it was apparent that this craft's drive derived from electromagnetic principles. The 4 pods contained antennas which generated an electric field. The magnetic field was supplied by the electric coil mentioned above. I will give a more detailed description later on. As part of our research, the coils on the saucer were activated and we put voltmeters on the wires so that we could measure the different voltages. We also observed alternating currents, various waveforms and different frequencies. The craft was levitated about 10 to 20 feet off of the hangar floor so that we could do further experimentation and tests. All sorts of antennas and very sophisticated electronic equipment had been set up, and some of it was quite unique. I had never seen it before and still haven't to this day save for this particular instance. There were signature analyzers, spectrum analyzers, and very advanced computers. Based upon my first-hand observations and the theories generated by our group, there had to be some sort of technical reality engineering system in it. What do I mean by reality engineering? Exactly that. I'm referring to the concept of building or creating a reality. If reality is defined as an agreed-upon system of perception and interaction that conforms to certain rules, reality engineering refers to changing that system. Or, more importantly, it refers to creating a different system that can interface with the original system or reality. I know that if I were building a spacecraft, I wouldn't want to rely on a ship that artificially, by machine, maintains a huge space inside of a small ship. If the machines were to fail, everything could crunch together and perhaps disappear. It could be a nightmare. If I were to do it, I would want a passive system. There would be no electricity and no power. By virtue of the physical shaped structure of the craft I had seen, an alternate reality would have to have been created on the inside. How to accomplish such a feat is another matter entirely, and that aspect will be discussed later on. After working with my engineering team, I concluded there was a single system behind the controls that used the 3 chairs to pick up commands from the beings in the chairs. The cluster of crystals behind the control room was a computer. The larger cluster of crystals on the lower deck, along with the antenna arrays, all within a coil around the base, I identified as a spacetime reality generator. It was a self-contained system and appears to be a simple setup. After returning to my job on Long Island, there was no mention of the flying saucer field trip by any of my coworkers. It was a confidential matter and was not to be talked about. When I finally did ask my colleagues, they had no recollection. At the same time, I was having memory problems of my own. I was living a buried life that I didn't have full recognition of until years later. It was in this other life that I was able to witness another UFO. This one happened to be in the underground facility at Montauk. In my buried life, I was working at both Brookhaven Labs and on the Montauk project and saw this craft during a work assignment. This saucer was more oval-shaped than the one from Wright-Patterson that I have already described. It had the same screens and chairs, but there were also knobs and buttons in addition to a different number of operating systems. I wasn't involved in reverse engineering this craft but was assigned only to help disassemble the different systems as well as the ship itself. The craft came apart in sections, which is similar to reports that have circulated about the ships of the gray aliens. In both of these saucers that I witnessed up close, the hull appeared to be an entire unit in itself. As we disassembled the craft at Montauk, I thought I saw a control system, a computer system and some sort of drive, but I was never able to figure out exactly what they were. There was also a radio room of some sort. It is obvious that this vehicle was not being operated under one cohesive engineering system like the one discussed previously. This saucer was never fired up, but I am not sure why. Perhaps they couldn't operate it or didn't know how. It is obvious to me from what I have personally experienced that the UFO at Wright-Patterson was the most advanced form available and could be considered the Cadillac of flying saucers. The only thing more advanced would be a purely spiritual vehicle. I will go deeper into the technical aspects of this state-of-the-art flying saucer, but first we will examine my next personal encounter with a UFO. See Appendix A for a summary of other types of UFOs that are of a lesser technology. Chapter 4, UFO Torpedo Man. My next encounter was in 1989, not too long before I was terminated from employment at the BJM company. BJM had been contracted by the government to build a special UHF transmitter and had done a pretty bad job of it. It had been constructed out of very modern avant-garde technology that simply didn't work. As I had a reputation for putting together technology for spook projects, they decided to turn the job over to me. After being given the assignment, I picked up the phone immediately and spoke to the customer, who told me that he required a pulse-modulated transmitter that transmitted at a specific frequency. The information on the exact frequency is still classified. I told him what he needed was a tube transmitter, not a solid-state configuration. After we spoke, I went through the warehouse at BJM and picked out an old airport transmitter that would put out about 500 watts of RF, radio frequency, in the UHF region. I dusted it off, fixed it up and got it operating to the customer's specifications. It was frequency pulse modulated and ran in the upper UHF band. After it was finished, we took a small helical antenna structure and mounted it on a tripod. Soon after, I was told to take the transmitter and drive it down to Fort Meade. I signed it out, put it in the back of my Dodge Caravan and made the 5-hour drive down to Maryland. Upon arriving at Fort Meade, I was surprised at the lax security. After identifying myself, they simply said that they knew who I was and that I could go down to Hangar 6A or some such designation. 2 men from the government soon joined me. I was told to set up the equipment and wait. One of the guys with me had a walkie-talkie. He got hold of somebody and began to talk into it. "We're ready," he said. Guess what I saw next? A small flying saucer approached until it was right in front of us. As soon as it reached us, it began to turn around. After being so instructed, I turned on the transmitter I brought with me and the saucer suddenly became unstable. It began to wobble and make strange noises. One of the men then said, "Shut it off. It works." They then told me to take the transmitter back to the plant at BJM and let it sit there. I went back and told my boss. He said that I could just put it on the back bench in my workspace for the time being. About 2 months after my trip to Maryland, I kept hearing that the satellite receiver group at BJM was working on some new equipment. According to the reports I was getting, they were tracking UFOs via satellites. What they were actually doing was picking up signals from satellites that had been designed to follow crafts by reference to their electromagnetic signature. This work originally began at a time when the Reagan administration had provided a huge budget for the Strategic Defense Initiative, more popularly known as Star Wars. At this particular time period, which I recall to be September 25, 1989, I was told to sign out the transmitter again and take it home. If anything were to go wrong, I was told the equipment was covered by the company's insurance policy. At 9 o'clock that same evening, I got a call telling me to take the transmitter to the south end of the William Floyd Parkway at 10 o'clock. People would be waiting for me at the end of the parkway and would give me further instructions. At around 9:30, 2 assistants from work showed up and said they were supposed to accompany me out to the parkway. We all hopped in my van and took off. Upon arriving at our destination, we found a police barricade. I drove up and said that I had some equipment from BJM and was told to report there. The police said they were expecting me. They told me to go down to the left and check in with the guys at the end of the parking lot. I did so and saw that some of them wore army-type military fatigues. Others were in plain clothes or business suits. I was then introduced to a man who told me to put the unit on the back of a Jeep. My associates and I then got in the Jeep and were driven down the sand dunes to Smith Point, located within Smith Point Park. When the Jeep stopped, we were shown a table that had already been set up for us. To the left of the table and towards the water was a big van with a spinning radar antenna on it. To the right of the table was a big dish with a huge thing in the middle of it that looked like a refrigerator. Normally, this is where the antenna structure would be placed. Towards the water and just ahead of us was a 400 Hz generator which was turned on and humming away. As I put the transmitter on the table, one of the guys waiting for us pointed out the modulation, power, and RF cables. He said to hook it up and we did. After that, he told us to make sure that everything was working. I then checked out all the stages and everything was operational. Then, he picked up a walkie-talkie and called in to someone. Next, someone else looked out the back of the nearby van and said, "Turn it on. We're ready for a test." When I turned on the transmitter, a sort of bluish glow came out of the center of the big dish. It was coming out of the big object that looked like a refrigerator. We could all see a little bit of blue glow reflecting out from the dish and headed towards the sky. Then the man who had called for the test yelled that everything was okay. We were told to stand by and wait. I believe this testing occurred at approximately 10:30 in the evening. Then, at about 11 o'clock or 11:15, we heard helicopters in the distance. They were headed towards Moriches Bay from the north. Suddenly, the helicopters began to circle around a point in the sky. A couple of big lights could be seen within the area of sky that the helicopters were circling. The lights, along with the pursuing helicopters, moved south over Moriches Bay. As it came directly over our heads, the crew next to me turned on very powerful lights and we saw a huge wedge-shaped UFO. It was triangular and appeared to be at least 300 feet across. It continued to move south until it reached the shore. Then, it made a U-turn and headed back north. By the time it arrived over the water of Moriches Bay, the equipment around me began to hum and buzz. The next thing we saw was the UFO fluttering and wobbling. It made strange whiny noises and then went down. There was a large splash and thud. No sooner had the UFO crash landed than the man in the van yelled out that the operation was finished. A man next to me said to disconnect the transmitter and put it in the Jeep. They wanted us to leave the area as soon as possible and told us to hurry up about it. My associates and I packed up the equipment and were soon on our way back home. On the return trip, we were trailed by some sort of agents. One of the agents sat in a car in front of my house the entire night. When my two associates left my house, two other agents followed them on their way out. Later that evening, I tried to phone them but my phone line was dead. I went to a neighbor's house and tried to reach them from there. While my neighbor's phone worked fine, I could not get through to my associates. Someone was apparently tampering with their phone lines. The following day, I went to work and was followed again. I was immediately put through a debriefing procedure and told to forget everything that I saw regarding the UFO incident. By this point, I had already learned how to counter their debriefing procedure. That is why I still remember this incident. The other two employees from the company don't remember anything at all. The entire incident that occurred is now somewhat famous on Long Island and in the UFO community. It is known as the Moriches Bay UFO crash. What happened afterwards at BJM was really the start of me breaking the "forget-me-not" security system at BJM. That is what they actually called it. This led to my getting laid off. Some people think that firing me may have backfired on BJM because it gave me ample time to research UFOs as well as Montauk, but this is not necessarily the case. Had I continued to work at BJM with a fully conscious memory, I would possibly have found out even more sensitive information. The crash I had witnessed at Moriches Bay was undeniable. I had seen something that was very real. I knew the government was interested in shooting something down, so obviously it wasn't their aircraft. This means that whatever was in the sky was some sort of off-world alien technology. The government must have viewed it as a threat. Also, this pattern of events fit in with what many people in the UFO and defense community have said for years. The Strategic Defense Initiative was not put forth to protect us from the Russians but from alien technology from outer space. President Reagan even spoke about this threat to an assembly at the United Nations. It is all too obvious. Deciding to study this phenomena a little bit more, I got together with many friends including George Dixon, who has extensively studied anthropology and has embraced the UFO phenomena from that perspective. I also consulted John Ford, the founder and president of the Long Island UFO Network. These researchers, along with many others and myself, sought to identify what the Moriches Bay crash actually was. Since then, I've become the science consultant to the Long Island UFO Network and have looked into these matters quite deeply. There have been a lot of other crashes and sightings on Long Island, but I do not have specific information on them. That is the province of other investigators. My own research has centered on the technology of UFOs, i.e. what they are and how they work. This includes how alternate realities are created and how such realities are moved. This will be covered in the next section of this book. Chapter 5, Technology. When I saw the disc-shaped saucer at Wright-Patterson, I was most impressed by the fact that there were no apparent controls with which to operate the craft or its various facilities. The only obvious answer to this enigma was that the controls were connected to the three chairs, as said earlier, hauntingly similar to the Montauk chair, in the control room, which were surrounded by 4 video screens. In other words, these types of ships fly literally by thought. The 3 pilots, I'm not exactly sure how the work is divided up between them. Think of what they want the ship to do. A computer then picks up the thoughts of the pilots and drives the devices which actually power the craft. When the military began to research these advanced UFOs, there was considerable trouble in figuring them out. The only technology they could refer to was our own technology. This consists of, in no small part, a flight computer and a control deck. Of course, the control deck can be thought to correspond with the chairs. The flight computer has already been identified with the crystals described previously. After that, our technology consists of communications, engines, control flaps and whatnot. In other words, we have in our aircraft, many diversified systems that the flight computer operates. What has been puzzling in the advanced-style UFO is that there is only one system that the computer operates and not a myriad of systems. The idea that they had a singular homogeneous system makes perfect sense if you consider what the military has done with flight simulator technology. Pilot simulation training began during World War II with John von Neumann's prototype-style computer. It has since been developed to the point today where electrodes can be connected to a trainee's head so that he can project his will into the computer in such a manner that his thoughts literally move the dummy aircraft to the left, right, etc. The electrodes attached to the head serve as a computer mouse. As this type of demonstration has been shown on common television, you can bet your bottom dollar that the state-of-the-art technology is far more developed. Of course, those familiar with stealth technology will know immediately what I am talking about. The pilots are trained in this manner, which is in fact a virtual reality-like setting. Whether a stealth bomber operates exclusively on a pilot's thoughts is an interesting question and one I do not know the answer to at this particular time. But, the stealth bomber is sometimes said to be a UFO, or to operate just like one. The next point we will consider in examining the technical basis of UFOs is the incredible gyrations and aerobatics these crafts have been seen to do at a distance. For example, a saucer will be flying along at anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 miles per hour when all of a sudden the craft will make a 90-degree right-angle turn or even a U-turn. It is a very well-known law of physics that for every action there is going to be an equal opposite reaction. If a UFO were to make such a sharp turn at high speeds, the principles of acceleration and deceleration would come into play. In other words, the pilots and all creatures and loose objects would be slammed against the opposite wall of the ship. Of course, no pilot could experience this trauma under normal circumstances. Some have theorized that space travelers could be suspended in liquid baths that would cushion them against sudden stops or turns, but this line of thinking is far too complex. The system I saw at Wright-Patterson was a device of simplicity. Even so, it took me a while to figure out how this craft actually worked. Although it employed anti-gravity, it was not an anti-gravity device by itself. Although it transmitted radio waves, it was not a radio transmitter by itself. Instead, it was a combination of these things, and many more, all put together. The big machine in the bottom of the craft with the pods and antenna structures was an electrogravitic spacetime reality generator. In other words, the device was equipped for anti-gravity maneuvers and was also able to generate its own realities in space and time. Each of the above two modes of operation have their own particular purposes. When the craft is to glide slowly or hover over a spot, the anti-gravity method of flight is employed. It is during this mode when you see the actual shape of the craft. What they are doing is controlling the distribution of gravitic currents all around the ship. In this mode, they are not going to make sudden turns because they are subject to the law of inertia. When a UFO makes a very fast takeoff, the operators are generating gravitation, but as they progress way beyond the speed of sound, they will move into a mode whereby they will generate their own reality. This is done by creating a reality bubble, not dissimilar to the soliton field that was generated during the Philadelphia experiment. Once this bubble is made, a craft can move at frightening breakneck speeds. When the UFO goes into impossible flight modes, this is the technology that has been employed. Once they have generated a reality bubble around themselves, they are inside the bubble and everything else is outside. With reference to the bubble itself, they are at rest. Being within the bubble or a still space, their craft can make right-angle turns, U-turns or do whatever aerobatics they want it to do. Of course, the only way they can accomplish this is if the mass of the bubble is created to be zero. If there is zero mass, there will be no inertia. Inertia equals 1/2 mv2 where m is mass and v is velocity 2 is squared, so that it read inertia 1/2 of mass times velocity squared. In this case, it doesn't matter what the velocity is if the mass is zero, even if versus is infinity. If a real zero-mass reality can be generated, the operators of such a craft can move that reality in any way they please. This principle is how most interstellar saucer flights are accomplished. If the flight isn't going to take forever, the travelers need to go beyond the speed of light. In order to accomplish this feat, the reality generated within the bubble must be designed to be relativistic to our reality. In other words, they will go beyond the speed of light with reference to our reality, but in reference to their own reality, within the bubble, they are not. Traveling at superluminal velocities, superlight travel, ships can travel from one end of the galaxy to the other in maybe a week of our time. They are moving at 1,000,000 times the speed of light by engineering a reality wherein the bubble is traveling at just that speed, with reference to our reality. In their reality, they might be moving at 0.7 c or 0.9 c where c refers to the speed of light. The next point to address is how the artificial bubble reality is created. Chapter 6: Twisters and Spinners. In order to convey how an artificial reality is created, it is first necessary to familiarize you with a couple of terms you probably haven't heard before: twister and spinner. These are highly technical terms that are the province of higher mathematics. It is, of course, presumptuous in the extreme to assume that most people reading this book were or are math majors. I will therefore reduce these concepts from the realm of pure mathematical equations into the realm of workable concepts that will enable the reader to understand the logical basis upon which an alternate reality can be formed. Therefore, all technical people should understand that my explanation could suffer here from oversimplification. Before we go into the more technical discussion of twisters and spinners, I would first like to bring forward to your consciousness the idea of a tornado. In various parts of the world, these are referred to as twisters and sometimes spinners. While this type of weather phenomenon is not identical to the twisters and spinners we will be discussing, it is related and will serve as an easily graspable example to most people. If you look through ordinary books in the library on the subject of tornadoes, you will find something very interesting. Very strange anomalies have been reported throughout history with regard to this phenomena. After a tornado has whipped through an area, you might find a straw embedded into a pane of glass or a car embedded into a steel wall. There are actual reports and pictures of such on file. Under the laws of physics as taught in universities, there is no explanation for this. In such an instance, you have molecules embedded into other molecules. All of this sounds hauntingly familiar to the reports of sailors being embedded in the bulkheads of the USS Eldridge during the Philadelphia experiment. What all of this means is that within the proximity of a tornado, paranormal phenomena can occur which suggests interdimensional activity. L. Frank Bohm's The Wizard of Oz suggests this very possibility when a tornado takes Dorothy to another world. Writers, particularly science fiction writers, often stumble upon the truth when they start exercising their subconscious. I hope that all of the above information will serve as a bridge to understanding the more technical aspects of twisters and spinners which we will now engage. Creating an artificial reality in a flying saucer or in any regard begins with a computer generating what is called a twister. As said previously, this is best conveyed in purely mathematical terms. A twister, like the entire subject of mathematics, is an abstract concept. It is a dimensionless point that travels in the path of a circle. We can say it exists because its path can be charted in equations. The equations are telling us that some point, although not existing in a solid and consistent manner on the coordinates of this dimension, is moving around and around in a circular pattern. Although it is not observable in this dimension, it is most easily understood if you consider it to be adjacent to or in the proximity of this dimension. Although a twister can't be seen, it is a mathematical fact. Those who are mathematically inclined will be interested to know that the concept of a twister comes from a subject called tensor analysis, which is an extension of calculus. A tensor is like a vector that goes in different dimensions, all at once. You can get an idea of how tensor analysis is used if you can imagine a squashed baseball. Tensor analysis would be used to create a formula for the exact shape of the squashed baseball. However, while the baseball is in the three-dimensional world, tensor analysis is not mathematically limited to only 3 dimensions. Those who want to read more on this subject can consult the books of Roger Penrose. 2 of his titles are Two-Spinner Calculus and Relativistic Fields, and Spinner and Twister Methods in Spacetime Geometry. Once a twister has been recognized and established to exist, the next step is to tap into the twister. This is done electromagnetically. When an electromagnetic field is generated, one introduces all sorts of wild and wonderful variables into the situation. Of course, this all depends on the exact nature of the electromagnetic field being employed. The electromagnetism creates a sympathy with the twister. Magnetism is a sympathetic reaction that brings it into this dimension and harnesses it to some extent. As the phantom particle now begins to observably rotate within this dimension, it is elongated into what is called a spinner. By definition, this operation would not absolutely have to be done electromagnetically. It could conceivably be done with any form of energy that would do the trick. For mathematicians, a twister is first generated with a function in the x-y plane. To stretch it into a spinner, you distort the x-y function with a z function. If you are working with an imaginary plane, you replace the x, y, z coordinates with I, j, k as is customary in math. A twister and then spinner can be generated out of an electromagnetic field which can be accomplished with a delta T antenna. This is a 3-dimensional octahedronal antenna with coils placed around the entire structure giving you an x, y and z axis. By modulating the x and y fields in a delta T, you can make the spinner take on different forms. The first step from a twister to a spinner has been described as the formation of an orbiting electromagnetic wave that forms a torus-like pattern. They start with a twister that is formed into an orbiting electromagnetic wave which looks like a torus. Then, the twister is elongated into a rotating cylinder also called a spinner. The cylindrical method is the easiest way I know of to get a spinner going. There are many different types of spinners that can be created depending on your imagination and, more importantly, on the technology you have with which to manipulate them. The standard vortex shape you hear so much about in science fiction and ufology is a conical form of spinner. You can also make a spheroid spinner by connecting the two ends of a rotating cylinder. The more imaginative can envision other shapes such as a whipsoid, an elongated spinner with a random path that follows the pattern of a whip, or other complex patterns. At this point, it is very important to mention something with regard to the spheroid shape mentioned above. The physical Earth is a spheroid. If you consider that the physical Earth itself is literally constructed upon a series of energy grids that conform to spirals of energy, one can visualize that the Earth itself was initially created out of a spinner. This line of thinking implies that someone engineered the Earth into reality. Was it God or an alien manipulator? It brings to mind all sorts of intriguing questions which are not the subject of the discussion at hand. As the center of one of these spinners is a void, this concept also conforms to the idea of a hollow Earth. The idea of the Earth having formed as a spinner also gives us an alternative view to the Big Bang theory of the universe. The Big Bang theory says that we all started from one point of explosion at the center of the universe. What I might call the spinner theory suggests that heavenly bodies may have formed as the result of a cosmic reality engineer creating an electromagnetic field that the planet is based upon. The Big Bang theory is correct to the degree it states there is a spiraling out from the center of the known universe, but its primary aim as used by the scientific establishment seems to be to sell us on the idea that we are all physical matter anyway. In other words, it is more propaganda. Of course, good propaganda is based upon as much truth as possible. There are a whole series of programs and patterns that can be programmed into twisters and spinners. Once power is put into them as well, you can generate a spatial warp. Out of that warp, a reality is engineered. This is done through radio transmission. At Montauk, we used a large transmitter along with a delta-T, octahedron-shaped, antenna to accomplish this same end. While I have personally experimented with impressing thought forms into the delta-T antenna, I have not made anything solid or physical with it. That would require considerable power. Although radio transmission was definitely used in the UFO I was aboard at Wright-Patterson, I was not able to identify any sort of specific radio transmitter that I was even slightly familiar with. It was stated in the Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, that the window frequency to the human consciousness is 400 to 450 MHz. What this means is that this particular frequency will carry information or ideas which we term consciousness. It is not open to question that radio and television carry words and ideas. The 400 to 450 MHz just happens to be how you get an idea into someone's head. How well this is accomplished and how forceful it is depends on various factors. The idea is that a properly educated and trained consciousness can project to another on this frequency. If the technology, which requires amplification of thoughts as well as a myriad of other factors, of the operators can make their ideas stick, you will have a whole series of circumstances that are consistently present, in other words, a reality. This area is actually as the center of one of these spinners is a void. This concept also conforms to the idea of a hollow Earth. The idea of the Earth having formed as a spinner also gives us an alternative view to the Big Bang theory of the universe. The Big Bang theory says that we all started from one point of explosion at the center of the universe. What I might call the spinner theory suggests that heavenly bodies may have formed as the result of a cosmic reality engineer creating an electromagnetic field that the planet is based upon. The Big Bang theory is correct to the degree it states there is a spiraling out from the center of the known universe, but its primary aim as used by the scientific establishment seems to be to sell us on the idea that we are all physical matter anyway. In other words, it is more propaganda. Of course, good propaganda is based upon as much truth as possible. There are a whole series of programs and patterns that can be programmed into twisters and spinners. Once power is put into them as well, you can generate a spatial warp. Out of that warp, a reality is engineered. This is done through radio transmission. At Montauk, we used a large transmitter along with a delta-T, octahedron-shaped antenna to accomplish this same end. While I have personally experimented with impressing thought forms into the delta-T antenna, I have not made anything solid or physical with it. That would require considerable power. Although radio transmission was definitely used in the UFO I was aboard at Wright-Patterson, I was not able to identify any sort of specific radio transmitter that I was even slightly familiar with. It was stated in the Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, that the window frequency to the human consciousness is 400 to 450 MHz. What this means is that this particular frequency will carry information or ideas which we term consciousness. It is not open to question that radio and television carry words and ideas. The 400 to 450 MHz just happens to be how you get an idea into someone's head. How well this is accomplished and how forceful it is depends on various factors. The idea is that a properly educated and trained consciousness can project to another on this frequency. If the technology, which requires amplification of thoughts as well as a myriad of other factors, of the operators can make their ideas stick, you will have a whole series of circumstances that are consistently present, in other words, a reality. This area is actually an entirely different and very huge subject which is properly labeled reality engineering. To summarize, a twister has no dimension. It is generated from a computer, encoded and then spread into a spinner. This starts out as a rotating cylinder which is in turn shaped into whatever form is desired by the operators. This creates a spatial warp around the specified area targeted. For practical purposes, it can be considered like a vacuum. In keeping with the principle that nature abhors a vacuum, the spatial warp serves as a backdrop for a new reality which is in essence a series of thought forms being transmitted at a frequency of 400 to 450 MHz. This gives you a bubble reality. Before we discuss how this bubble reality can interface with other realities, it is appropriate to give a brief history on how the subject of physics developed. Chapter 7, A Review of Physics. Before Isaac Newton came along and began to codify the first phase of what we know as modern physics, the world was a very different place. Alchemy was the order of the day when it came to learning the secrets of the universe. Alchemy dealt with the qualitative as opposed to the quantitative nature of matter. This means that it was broken down into the four elements of earth, air, water and fire. This subject further delved into the sympathies or correspondences between material objects and other forces. In all due respects, this was the study of magic. Common history books on the sciences will sometimes portray alchemy as a subject that was based upon infantile and naive observations yet paved the way for the investigation that would result in modern science. Almost always, alchemy is portrayed in a ludicrous manner. It will also say that the goal of alchemy was the transmutation of metals into gold. While there is definite truth in the last statement, it is misleading. Alchemy in its highest form was concerned with the transmutation of consciousness. Physical objects were considered a manifestation of consciousness and were not thought of as independent or objective objects in their own right. Of course, if one could change consciousness and was very good at it, one could also change metal into gold. In other words, alchemy is another way of saying metaphysics. Both these words have their own specific connotations, but they are both concerned with the idea of forces that are superior to the common physical world. It was out of this background that modern physics arose. If you look at some of the old alchemical writings, you will discover they were written in code. In other words, a modern historian investigating the subject wouldn't have a clue. The true secrets of alchemy were relegated to the secret societies of the day. Modern science got its first shot in the arm when Isaac Newton discovered and formulated the laws of gravity and motion. These laws are still with us today for the most part, as they are of undeniable practical use. If you study his entire career, you will discover that Newton was a brilliant man and that his work was nothing short of astounding. He claimed to be inspired from a higher source. The major flaw in his work was that he considered objects to be at rest. For practical use, his idea was workable. Newton's laws worked and helped to launch the mechanical age. The next major event in the history of science occurred in 1887 with the famous Michelson–Morley experiment. This experiment was considered a major and astonishing failure, yet it sent shockwaves through the scientific community that are still with us today. Albert Michelson, a physics professor, and Edward Morley, a chemistry professor, sought to prove the existence of a substance called the ether, which was believed to fill all of space and was also thought to serve as the substance along which light waves traveled. Virtually all scientists of the day believed in the concept of the ether. It was a unified field of sorts, although it really couldn't be called such, as there were too many unknowns in the popular physics of that day. The concept of the ether began with the alchemists of old. They conceived of a medium that embraced the entirety of existences. To them, the ether was unlimited and not only served normal space but the subtle and spiritual aspects of existence as well. It was the very fabric of existence itself. When the influence of Newtonian physics began to place the emphasis on strictly physical concerns, the more noble aspects of the ether were lost. As physics developed, the concept of the ether was used to describe the medium through which light and electromagnetic waves traveled. The logic employed was that if sound made waves in the air and that if motion in the water made ripples or waves, then light should consist of waves in a similar medium. Further, if there were such an ether, it was readily assumed that light would be slowed against an ether wind as it traveled. Thus, the ether could be measured and proven to exist. Michelson and Morley set out to prove whether the ether existed by emitting two beams of light from a single light source and measuring the difference it took the two beams to return to the original spot. This was done with mirrors in such a manner as to replicate one beam moving with the orbit of the Earth while the other beam would be going in a counter-orbital direction. The theory at the time was that the Earth in orbit was moving along a wind, the wind of the ether, or momentum. Michelson and Morley discovered to their surprise and dismay that the two beams of light returned to the source in identical time periods. This meant that the ether had no visible signs of evidence. It didn't exist. The news of this experiment rocked the scientific world of the day, and for all practical purposes, the idea of the ether was abandoned and eventually highly ridiculed and scoffed at with much disdain. Of course, this entire assumption suggests that the ether is a measurable force. Just because it was not measurable, it was denounced, as scientists are quick to dismiss anything they can't measure. None of this actually meant that there was no ether. It just meant that there was nothing found that met with their preconceived notions. Many of you in the reading audience may have never heard about the Michelson–Morley experiment, but any scientist knows it very well. What is significant about it is that it was one of the biggest PR events in the history of modern science and has been hailed as a major breakthrough. It changed the entire direction of scientific thought and at the same time buried the idea of the ether. At the same time, in the collective unconscious, it served to bury the idea of the alchemists' ether too. What is particularly interesting about the Michelson–Morley experiment is that breakthroughs in science generally result in tremendous discoveries and solutions to all sorts of problems. It is hard to think of any technological advances that resulted directly from this experiment. Even Albert Einstein, who was the next scientific celebrity to leave his mark on the scene, said it had no significant impact on his work. Before we examine his work, we will first take a look at some interesting aspects of his personal history that have been generally overlooked. Chapter 8: The History of Einstein. Albert Einstein was a most curious figure. Heralded as one of the most brilliant minds of history, he was renowned for not being able to find his own house in Princeton. During his stay at Cal-Tech, he routinely depended on others to tell him how to get to work. One story even has him falling down a manhole as he strolled along a walkway. Before we examine his contributions to science, we will first give an historical account of key points in his background that are often overlooked. In the general public's mind, Albert Einstein is without a doubt the most famous figure in the history of physics. Most people have not heard the story that he studied in Zurich under one Hermann Minkowski, who taught the unified field theory. Minkowski is mentioned in many physics books as Einstein's teacher and is even credited as playing a pivotal role in Einstein's ideas. Minkowski's role is severely understated. The information about Minkowski teaching the unified field theory was told to Peter Moon by Dr. Gene Keating, a medical doctor from Delaware. According to his information, Einstein was sent to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School, now known as the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule or ETH for short, by the Rothschild Banking Consortium. When Einstein failed the entrance exams, Rothschild pulled strings to get Einstein admitted. In the book Einstein, His Life and Times by R. W. Clark, on page 35 Minkowski describes Einstein as a «lazy dog», who «never bothered about maths at all». When Einstein graduated in 1900, he found a job in the Swiss Patent Office in Bern, Switzerland. It is while in this position that he produced his first major scientific theory. Although some people have claimed this was an unlikely job for someone of his talents, one sees a pattern being set. Einstein is sponsored by a vested interest, the Rothschilds. He gets a job in the patent office and gains access to the cutting-edge scientific discoveries of the day. He then produces theories that are acclaimed by the press with accolades no other physicist has received before or since. Of course, the Rothschilds controlled the press. There is no contention here that Einstein is incorrect, but there is a suspicious pattern in the way physics has been rendered to the general public. Einstein was heralded every step of the way. Although his findings leave the world of physics wide open, his ideas were portrayed so as to reinforce our limitations. Again, we are forced to look at Einstein's impact on world technology. The most immediate impact was the atom bomb, which would be followed by nuclear power several years later. This is a controversial field to say the least. The nuts and bolts theory of the atom bomb project were actually provided by John von Neumann, but it was Einstein's backing of the project, which he later regretted, and letter to Roosevelt which sold the president on its possibility. Einstein's theories helped pave the way, and he is sometimes credited with putting it within reach. Although a tremendous amount of technology has sprouted out of the U.S. space program, Einstein's impact on that was virtually nil. A magician named Jack Parsons, who believed in the principles of alchemy, was primarily responsible for the development of the solid fuel rocket and the consequent success in getting mankind into outer space. There is considerable irony in all of this. Einstein is portrayed as a gentle humanitarian while Parsons has been cast as a devil worshipper. The fact that Einstein had difficulty finding his way to familiar locations is not the only piece of evidence to suggest he was programmed. There is a very interesting mention of Einstein in the book The Wind and Beyond, which is the autobiography of Theodor von Karman. A friend of John von Neumann, both men were from Hungary. Von Karman co-founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory with Jack Parsons, Frank Molina and Ed Foreman. He was the fatherly figure of the group and was considered one of the top scientists in the United States. In his autobiography, von Karman begins chapter 33 with a very puzzling statement. He mentions entering a sanitarium at Lake George, New York, in order to convalesce from a serious intestinal operation. Since when does one need to convalesce in a nut house? Von Karman then mentions that after falling ill with carcinoma, he was ordered to a private clinic in New York City where a famous German surgeon by the name of Dr. Nissen operated on him. I will quote from page 267 of his book. He, Nissen, said later that he had saved my life, but I saw only that I was left with a hernia after the operation. I told the doctor that if an aircraft mechanic were to make a weld of metal similar to the junction he had made in my intestines, he would be fired. But Dr. Nissen had no sense of humor. He reported to my worried sister that the shock of the operation must have disturbed my mind. My only consolation was that, 2 months later, he operated on Albert Einstein and also left him with a hernia. The above quote speaks for itself, but there is an even more bizarre aspect to this story. Those of you who have read The Montauk Project and Montauk Revisited may remember the character I called Dr. Reinhardt. He had claimed to me that he was John von Neumann and had been put into a witness relocation program. When I introduced him to Peter Moon in September of 1993, Peter was struck by the fact that this man has an enormous bulge between his legs, which I have been told was the result of a botched hernia operation. He has lived with it for an amazing 12 years. The above circumstantial evidence suggests these men were manipulated or programmed. One person has even suggested that their testes or parts thereof were extracted in an attempt to reproduce their sperm. The theory behind this is that brilliant minds could be produced from artificial insemination. That it was a German doctor only adds to the intrigue. Amazing as it may sound, there is no intention here to knock any of Einstein's discoveries and theorems. But it should be pointed out that a media spin was put on his work ever since the beginning of his public career. Nikola Tesla's work was much more remarkable and practical in nature, yet he was given nowhere near the acclaim of Albert Einstein. With Einstein's work, there is not much wrong with what he had to say, but there are a tremendous amount of things he did not say. It was rumored since the days of the Philadelphia experiment that Einstein had completed the unified field theory and that it was kept secret by the military. The article from Time magazine on the preceding pages substantiates these claims. This brief overview of Einstein's history will hopefully enable everyone to consider his work in a new light, no pun intended. We will now continue our review of physics beginning with his work. The following article was originally printed in the Montauk Pulse of Spring 1994, Volume 1, Issue Number 6. Einstein's unified field work documented. On a research trip to the public library, I stumbled upon an interesting article. Before I got to the material I was looking for, I noticed a bright yellow band on the binding of a book. 1943 appeared in black letters. It was a summary of Time magazine articles from 1943. I picked it up and looked for news releases from August of that year, the alleged date of the Philadelphia experiment. To my surprise, there was an article on Albert Einstein and the Institute of Advanced Study where the Philadelphia experiment was reportedly hatched. It was dated August 9, 1943, and you can find it in that issue of Time magazine. The article was entitled, "Cooking with Water," and read as follows. Princeton, NJ has one school whose teachers do not count on teaching their students a single solitary fact. It is the 10-year-old Institute for Advanced Study. Its faculty of 16 includes Albert Einstein. Its 28 students do postgraduate research, are so expert in their fields that they are presumably aware of all the known facts involved. All that the Institute's teachers hope to do is to broaden and deepen their students' points of view toward their subjects by joint approaches from new angles. The students hear few formal lectures, take no examinations, get no degrees. Last week, however, many were hard at work in the kind of abstruse study which used to be a European specialty. Albert Einstein himself was busy trying to unify certain theories of gravitational and electrical forces in order to solve some complex mathematico-physical problems for the U.S. Navy. His aureole of white hair droops in summer's heat, a string upholds his cheap blue denim pants. Says he, Here we cook with water. Interpreted a colleague. We perform no miracles. A current item of Einsteiniana titillating the Institute. On one of his blackboards bearing a brain-taxing mathematical equation, the charwoman found the word, erase. On another blackboard, marked, do not erase, was blazoned the formula 2 plus 2 equals 4. The handwriting was on the wall. What is also amusing about this article is that Einstein is described as keeping up his pants with a string. For those of you who remember Dr. Reinhardt, the man mentioned in Montauk Revisited, who Preston believes is John von Neumann, I didn't mention that he also kept his cheap pants up with a rope. Do unified field scientists have some secret taboo against wearing belts? Does the combination of metal and leather affect their thinking process? Or better yet, does wearing ropes give them a strange kundalini power? Probably, the very nature of their thinking process causes them to disregard their personal appearance. But, it should be mentioned that both von Neumann and Einstein have been pictured in their early days as wearing suits and looking fashionable for the times. One has to seriously wonder if the blatant disregard for their self-image is related to some sort of programming. Chapter 9, The Speed of Light. After the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887, the next big news to shake the world of physics was Einstein's special theory of relativity, which was first made public in 1905. In Chapter 5, I said the reality generated within a bubble reality must be designed to be relativistic to our reality. In other words, the travelers in the bubble will go beyond the speed of light with reference to our reality, but in reference to their own reality, within the bubble, they are not. This is a bit of an oversimplification because according to Einstein's special theory of relativity, nothing can travel faster than 186,000 miles per second, the speed of light. Einstein's theory includes the principle that no means of energy whatsoever can move faster than c, the speed of light. Therefore, if the travelers within a saucer's bubble reality were moving at a reasonable speed in their own reality, but were moving faster than the speed of light with reference to our reality, there has to be some accountability for the fact that energy in our reality cannot go faster than c. All of this, of course, presents limitations with consequent problems of theory. Before we discuss this further, it is appropriate to give a brief overview of some key developments in the history of physics. When Einstein came along and introduced us to the special theory of relativity, he said that the speed of light is constant and independent of the motion of the light source. In other words, no matter what observation point we are in, light moves at a constant speed. This is a most interesting statement. What is even more interesting is what Einstein does not say. He does not tell us about the speed of light after it is passed through a prism. If you put a light through a prism, it will display a spectrum that breaks down light into different colors with accompanying different speeds. The lowest frequencies have faster speeds while the higher frequencies have slower speeds. At first glance, you might think that the speed of light is not a constant speed and that Einstein was wrong. Well, not exactly. If you look at the world around you, you will again possibly think Einstein is wrong because the world is full of different and beautiful colors that are moving at different speeds. The light Einstein is referring to in his special theory of relativity is not the same light you see in the everyday world. He is talking about light in an absolute vacuum. If you were to measure any specific form of light you encounter in your travels, it could only approach the speed of light. Even outer space is not a perfect vacuum and the light therein could only come approximately close to the speed of light. Actually, laboratory vacuums can do better than outer space. Although lab vacuums are technically not absolute vacuums either, they can come pretty close. All of this tells us that the light Einstein is talking about is something that we do not have a reference for in normal experience. Of course, the colors we see in life are a distortion of true light. Most of our light is emitted from the heat of the sun, which is distorted through our atmosphere. While some scientists of the day stated that light consisted of continuous waves, Einstein's further research led him to believe that light consisted of a continuous stream of particles which he termed photons. Scientists have since hotly debated whether light consists of waves or particles. This is an intriguing area of research in itself, and some people even meditate on the exact point where a wave becomes a particle with consequent transcendental experiences. In a pure vacuum, photons will manifest as a wave of pure energy. They do not manifest as particles. This is pure light as Einstein defined it in his special theory of relativity. But, when light is subjected to a magnetic field, it changes and breaks down into particles or photons. In such a state, it is no longer C. In other words, it is no longer the same light that moves at a constant speed. In this sense, it can be said that magnetism is an intrinsic factor in the creation of matter, if not the primary factor. It is also noteworthy that everything you see in the world around you is magnetized light, which is in reality a distortion of pure light, or C. The idea that magnetizing pure light turns this particular type of energy into particles is very important. The corollary of that statement is that if you demagnetize light, you are going to have pure light provided you are in a vacuum. Next, let us consider what happened during the Philadelphia experiment. There, the Navy had extensive degaussing coils placed around the hull of the ship. They were attempting to demagnetize the hull so that the ship would not trip underwater mines, which were designed to explode when coming into the magnetic range of the metal hull. As there was also a soliton field created around the ship, this served as the vacuum or bubble reality. When the ship was demagnetized, the particles of matter became waves and the ship was gone. The consequent weirdness that ensued is another matter entirely. The general principle is that if you demagnetize matter, which can be done through the use of coils as was done in the Philadelphia experiment and as described in the UFO I went aboard, you are converting it into pure light, which is something that cannot be experienced in everyday reality. It is a pure energy and could even be considered a realm unto itself. Once light or matter has been demagnetized and turned into pure waves, it has to be manipulated or controlled in some fashion if it is to be used. This is where the frequency of 435 MHz comes into play. As was said earlier, 400 to 450 MHz is the window to human consciousness. It is also a truism that there is a noise peak emanating from the Milky Way at 435 MHz. The stars emanate this frequency. Everything in our reality is believed to exist on this undercurrent of reality. In other words, it appears that 435 MHz is the background reality of our universe. If light is demagnetized and in waveform, transmissions can be inserted into it that will reassemble the light. If one can project consciousness into the vacuum that has been demagnetized, the waveform has been given an advice or program command which will result in a materialization at some point. There are various ways one can imagine this to be done. In this sense, light from a pure vacuum is demagnetized and exists in a void. If one sends a transmission into that void at 435 MHz, a thought form is created that reassembles the light into a reality. The important point is that this is the general principle on how space travel, an allegedly impossible task, can be accomplished. There is no question that 435 MHz not only accesses consciousness but emanates from our galaxy. Unfortunately, there is no available information on this frequency that I am currently aware of. It is still a mystery, and we hope that someone in the reading audience can supply further information. It is possible that information on this frequency is one of the most closely guarded secrets in our universe. If it is indeed the background to our reality, it is quite possible that knowledge of this information would enable one to literally change reality before our very eyes. Technical people should consult the definition of 435 MHz provided in the glossary of this book. Now that we have examined some of Einstein's statements from a fresh perspective, let's take a look at what he actually said in his theory of relativity, as taken from Webster's New World Dictionary. 1. There is no observable absolute motion, only relative motion. 2. The velocity of light is constant and not dependent on the motion of the source. 3. No energy can be transmitted at a velocity greater than that of light. 4. The mass of a body in motion is a function of the energy content and varies with the velocity. 5. Matter and energy are equivalent. 6. Time is relative. 7. Space and time are interdependent and form a four-dimensional continuum. 8. The presence of matter results in a warping of the spacetime continuum, so that a body in motion passing nearby will describe a curve, this being the effect known as gravitation, as evidenced by the deflection of light rays passing through a gravitational field. Einstein is telling us that there is a fourth dimension which consists of time and space. It does not take a genius to realize that if matter results in a warping of the spacetime continuum, that everything in our world is a distortion of a more basic reality, the fourth dimension. This only backs up what I've been saying, but as was said earlier, a negative media spin has been done with most of his work. If you magnetize pure light, it will bend and distort. It is interesting to note that the word magnet actually derives from the root magus, which means magician or practitioner of magic. The alchemical analogies and correspondences never seem to leave us if we bother to look for them. Our three-dimensional universe, as it appears to us, is actually magnetized light. In the previous chapter, we accepted that one could not only convert matter to energy but to a higher form of energy than is actually experienced in this universe. Light, demagnetized light, to be more specific. We were concerned with traveling at the speed of light or exceeding it. This requires the warping of reality as we know it. Actually, the fourth-dimensional reality had to have been warped in order to get us into our current condition. For practical purposes, a warp means that the bubble travelers have gone from one area of the universe to another by cheating, because the energy could not be displaced without appearing somewhere else. Or, it means that a warp, tunnel or vortex, opened up and the bubble travelers went through it and that no displacement of energy took place. The definition of warp is to twist, bend or distort. Obviously, one has to twist or bend space to accomplish this. Because time is intrinsically and mathematically connected to space, one needs to warp space and time. In order to understand how this could conceivably take place, we need to continue our review of the history of physics. As science developed in the early part of the 20th century, Einstein's discovery of photons or particles of light helped lead to a new subject which is now called quantum mechanics. This subject deals with the quanta, that the known nuclear particles, protons, neutrons, electrons, etc. consist of. Although Einstein never fully embraced this field, there were plenty of notable scientists who did. John von Neumann was at the forefront and we can learn from one of his statements. He said that the sheer volume of mathematical papers of the day made it entirely impossible to read and understand them all. He estimated the most one could grasp was 10% of what was out there. Obviously, there was more theoretical science being developed than one could even comprehend, scientist or not. Quantum mechanics is primarily a theoretical subject which seeks to discover and explain the tiniest particles of existence. There are many who accept it and some who do not. Those physicists who are called purists, when it comes to the hard physical sciences, often refute the general and specific theories that have been offered in the quantum world. While they sometimes have very valid points, much of the criticism of quantum physics is by those who are given to rant and rave and have an agenda of their own. The subject of quantum mechanics becomes very helpful in trying to understand what a warp is, especially when we consider one of the tiny particles of physics, the quark. A quark refers to a subatomic particle. In other words, if you break down an atom into the particles that make it up, you will find they are made up of quarks. Of course, modern quantum physics has discovered all sorts of different names for particles that accompany or make up quarks, but an explanation of those becomes rather complex in a work of this sort. Those interested can read up on it. The main point of a quark in this discussion is that experimental observation of these particles have demonstrated that they are not stable in reference to time. To make this clearer, the particles that make up our reality are not stable in our reality. They will appear and then disappear. If we want to consider quarks to be waves of energy, whereby the particle is considered to be the manifestation of a wave, that is fine. But that wave of energy is not entirely traceable in terms of normal electromagnetic phenomena in this reality. In any case, a quark as well as other subatomic particles are referenced to some other reality. If they were not, they would appear consistently within our reality. If the quark is a wave, then such a wave is emanating from another reality. The carrier is not found in our reality, according to current measurement standards, but would obviously be bridging to our reality because it can be partially perceived. That it can bridge to our reality suggests that it can be traced. We just haven't discovered the precise means to do so. The quark is therefore demonstrably interfacing with another reality and doing it on a regular basis. The idea of the quark has been introduced so you will understand that there is a bridge between this reality and another one. Some theoreticians refer to these other realities as chaos. We will deal with that aspect in just a bit. When a UFO moves beyond the speed of light from one location to another in such a manner so as to apparently violate Einstein's theory of relativity, it is warping or bridging to another reality and then re-entering this one. Of course, Einstein never said that you couldn't go outside of our reality and thereby exceed the speed of light. He just said that you cannot go beyond the speed of light within any particular reference frame. When a reality bubble is created within a UFO to protect the creatures aboard and maintain their normal reality, the rest of the ship can travel at high speeds but ultimately will have to warp out of this reality if it is going to move to another star system with any reasonable speed. It does so by bridging to another reality and then coming back to this one, not unlike the quark. Earlier, I referred to chaos, and this is very important when we consider the subject of UFOs. It is also important when we consider the subject of quantum mechanics. As that subject developed, it became obvious that no matter how intriguing the theories, none of them offered scientists information by which they could absolutely predict the behavior of subatomic particles. You can understand how lack of prediction can drive a scientist crazy, and understandably so when you consider that their profession is based upon predicting results. Instead, quantum mechanics developed along the lines of probability. In other words, quantum physicists would predict behavior in terms of statistical probability based upon observation. This is like watching a baseball player hit for a certain batting average. No matter what his average or the circumstances, his next turn at bat is entirely unpredictable. Einstein parted company with the quantum physicists when he made his famous statement, "God does not play dice with the universe." He, as well as many others, believed that quantum physics was only describing phenomena that could ultimately be predicted with supreme cause and effect. Quantum mechanics as it stood was only an incomplete science that could predict probabilities. It was rejected because it was not absolutely precise beyond the shadow of a doubt. The probabilities the quantum physicists were spouting were really opening the door to a subject that made traditional scientists very uncomfortable: chaos. Somewhat humorously, chaos could be considered the shadow beyond the doubt. An entire new subject called chaos theory has since developed, which seeks to track and categorize phenomena hitherto unknown. For example, random matter in nature is broken down into repeating patterns that reveal forms of geometric order that were previously unsuspected. No matter the various advances that are made and the symmetries and order that are found, further chaotic and unpredictable factors can always be discovered in both regular and biological matter. This could also be linked to the radical factor in evolution. Chaos theory tells us that basically anything you can conceive of does exist or will exist. It is an unlimited concept of existence. This totally embraces our current times where all sorts of paranormal and anomalous phenomena are beginning to get recognition. It only fits that UFOs would be opening the doors to chaos. The word chaos itself has been given a somewhat sinister reputation, but the concept is largely misunderstood. The concept itself was known by the ancients and is referred to as chaos magic in popular occult literature. Author Peter L. Carroll defines chaos as the force that animates all events in the cosmos. He says that while others may refer to this phenomena as God or the Tao, he prefers to call it chaos, because this term is virtually meaningless and free from the childish, anthropomorphic ideas about religion. Obviously, if one can harness the forces of chaos, one could be said to have supernatural powers. These could be the powers of Christ or of darker forces. It depends upon the intent of the user. In summary of the last few chapters, we have traced the evolution of science to the point where it seeks to comprehend the predictability and consequent understanding of the entire universe. Where pure science ends, we are left with the void of creation. This includes the bizarre, the incredible and the fantastic. And while I have sought to enlighten everyone on the scientific logic of UFOs, the phenomena that comes with them cannot be termed to be other than bizarre. It is with this in mind that we introduce the next part of this book, which will include aliens, abductions, and implants. While these subjects are considered generally chaotic and crazy by the news media and some of the general population as well, it is important that these subjects be categorized with as much accuracy as possible. As a phenomenon, they can no longer be denied. I will begin by discussing my own personal experiences which led to an encounter in the Pleiades. Chapter 11, Contact. I grew up in a rather sickly fashion. There was a physical irregularity with my tongue, and I didn't talk until I was about 5. As soon as this was discovered, my doctor performed an operation and I began to talk immediately. In fact, my mother said I was quite a chatterbox. I knew how to talk, but hadn't had the chance my entire life. Despite this improvement, I had frequent illnesses and problems. These climaxed at the age of 12 when I passed out twice as the result of a heart murmur. As I grew into my teens, things didn't get much better. I was far more uncoordinated at that age than the average teenager. We finally found out that I had some form of a neurological disease more popularly known as cerebral palsy. This means that while I was able to think and have an active mind, the signals were not getting to the muscular structure correctly and I consequently appeared to be very gawky. By the time I had reached 17, these problems had cleared up rather suddenly and without explanation. Although I could now physically do anything I wanted, my prior health history resulted in my family doctor arranging to have me declared 4F with no examination by the military. It is possible I was already being slated as an employee for the Montauk Project. While there is still no official explanation for my resurgence in health, it could possibly be connected to some very bizarre dreams I began to have at about the age of 16 or 17. The most common dream was this big god who was blue-eyed, blonde-haired and very human in appearance. He would take me with him and we would visit various places. At about the same time that I began having these dreams, a voice suddenly appeared in my head. It was not demonic or negative but was very intelligent. I could carry on conversations with it. Although my health had improved considerably, the dreams and the strange voice made me wonder what was going on. I had to consider whether I was crazy as these were obviously not normal experiences that society understood. As a result, I entered college and decided I would become a shrink. I subsequently learned that most psychology students pursue the subject in order to understand themselves. I definitely was in that category. In the beginning, I was concerned that I might be suffering from multiple personality syndrome, but that was soon dismissed. The knowledge I had obtained from my experiences was too broad-based to be attributed to another identity lurking within my mental circuitry. There was something else going on of a higher order. It was not long before I became the focus of my hypnosis class. I would be regressed and taken back to the times of my dreams. My hypnosis professor was convinced that I was sincere and that I thoroughly believed I had been taken into the confidence of tall blonde aliens, who were well built and stood 7 to 7.5 feet in height. Further regressions revealed that I believed these creatures to be very nice and benevolent. I had asked these aliens if they were going to hurt me and they said no. They responded that I must have been thinking of the Zetas, Greys, who do medical examinations that intrude into the body. I don't remember the name of this god, but he told me his race didn't need to intrude physically. He had me stand by a pole from which he was able to do a complete readout on my medical condition. In total, I was regressed about 8 times in front of the entire hypnosis class. This is somewhat remarkable because if someone tries to hypnotize me today, it doesn't work. According to these regressions, I was taken into the confidence of the Pleiadians at about age 15 and transported to their planet for medical rehabilitation and further education. Whether these encounters were in the dream state or in another constellation, I cannot really say. All I know is that after I had these experiences, I suddenly appeared to have a complete mastery of electronics. This was immediately noticeable to my parents and was most perplexing to them. I also had a guiding voice appear in my mind that would talk to me and tell me where to find answers to questions that I had. Whatever had occurred in the objective universe with these various experiences, my life had changed drastically for the better. I had gained incredible knowledge and a healthier body than I had previously experienced. The debilitating effects from the cerebral palsy even left. It is important to keep these facts in mind when evaluating the relative truth of what the Pleiadians taught me about themselves and their planet. Chapter 12, The Pleiades. At about the age of 15, I was transported on a spaceship to a small base located on one of the moons of Jupiter. I believe it was Europa. There, I was examined and put through a lot of testing. There were no bad memories from the experience. In fact, they were quite good. I even remember eating like a king. I was also shown their forms of entertainment which were very similar to ours. They included movies, video games and the like. It was apparent that these beings were essentially human and enjoyed the same things humans do. I was then put on the ship again for a ride that lasted what I thought to be about an Earth day. I soon stepped into a very lush green and beautiful world they called Alderaan. I was then taken through cities which had tall spires and buildings made of what appeared to be glass. The sky was blue and the visual scapes were breathtakingly beautiful. The air was quite crisp with no pollution. I was told the water was very pure. Long ago, there had been problems with pollution that had found its way into the food chain. This was corrected and they had gone back to the food chain long since. The fauna and animal life on Alderaan is very close in similarity to that of the Earth. The atmosphere is richer in oxygen than Earth's with a 28 to 30% content. The sunlight appears similar and the distance of their sun is more or less 93 million miles away. The primary difference between Earth and Alderaan is the construction and landscaping. Where we have cities full of roads, macadam and homes, their planet is dominated by fauna and gardens. There are wide plains of grass and forests as well as large areas of primitive jungle. What I saw was an absolutely beautiful garden environment where the buildings were positioned in such a way as to accent the garden. The idea of this environment was that the ecosphere had priority. Oxygen replenishment was at the top of the list and human civilization was put in as an adjunct to the garden. It wasn't supposed to stand out but rather blend in with the garden environment. I was given a tour of the city. The people looked just like humans and appeared very healthy. They did not appear to be controlled nor were they on drugs. From what I was told, the various individuals of the planet did what they were best suited for in accordance with what they wanted to do. There was no money system such as we know. The buildings were a rectilinear type construction similar to our world except that the corners were rounded. There were no shingles or anything similar. The outside walls were a uniformed surface with the windows blended into the walls so that the smooth surface was maintained. Some of the buildings looked like they were of metallic construction while others appeared to be made of stone. There were different color schemes, but they were all designed to complement the landscape. Although none of the buildings were dome-shaped or round, some of the structures had dome-shaped windows which stood out like hemispherical bubbles. The inside of the structures confused me and I couldn't figure out how the buildings were constructed. There were no panels or joints to reveal how things fit together. It looked like one amorphous wall. I could not see any welds on the walls, and I had to wonder if the whole configuration was molded in a big cast and put into place. The interiors were very plain and usually consisted of a single color. Everything was very conservative with no stripes or cluttered patterns. The furniture was modern but also plain and appeared to be cast out of plastic. The furniture was similar to the buildings in that you couldn't see how it was constructed. They had reclining chairs with levers, but no screws. I tipped one over to look at it but couldn't understand the mechanisms. The homes of the natives were typically single-family units. Most of them were tastefully placed throughout the landscape. Aside from the rounded corners and plain surface, they were somewhat similar to suburban houses on Earth except that they blended in with the environment. The insides of the houses were again plainly furnished with solid colors. There was also artwork which was absolutely beautiful. It consisted primarily of renditions of the planet's natural settings. One piece of art depicted a farm setting. They had some farms although much of their food was synthesized. There were also view screens which possessed a sound system, but I couldn't find any speakers. The audio might have been transmitted directly to the senses. I don't know. There were no streets as we know them. Transport was by foot save for a public transporting device which would send you to any potential location. A port for this transportation service could be found in each home. There were no vehicles of any kind. From the tour of the city, I was taken to what was called an education center. There, I was put through a process which they said gave me the equivalent of 4 different doctorate degrees on Earth. These were in the subjects of physics, electronics, psychology and divinity. They said this knowledge would eventually surface during my life on Earth. While I was being educated, I was also taken to their medical center and put through a testing procedure. They got rid of the neurological problems I suffered from, which would explain why the awkwardness in my own life disappeared practically overnight. They also got rid of the heart murmur. My family doctor proclaimed this cure to be a miracle. He had checked my heart and heard a murmur loud and clear. 1 month later it was gone, but he didn't know why. Further neurological tests were done, but they found I had no more control problems. Obviously, I was very pleased with my newfound friends in the Pleiades. The Pleiadians are just people like you or I, only they are more developed. They have been around much longer and they live longer. They live to about 1,000 of their years, which equates to about 700 Earth years. Most of them looked almost as if they were carbon copies of each other. They all had blue eyes and blonde hair, but their personalities were different. Their dress was plain and usually consisted of a single color. Health problems are virtually non-existent. While I received my education, I would go home in the evening with the chief scientist. The Pleiadians had hobby rooms and his was a lab in the back of his house. It ran along the entire length of the house and was probably 100 by 30 feet. It was very well equipped and incredibly neat. It consisted of super advanced electronics with only a few of the items having any recognizable controls. This was also the case with the electronic devices I saw in the government and science centers. This man collected old technology in the same manner that I collect old radio equipment. It was his hobby and he enjoyed it. He told me that some of his collection went back thousands and thousands of years. Some of it even looked like equipment you could find on Earth today. Apparently, their research facilities had instruments like ours because this equipment is probably the most versatile for R&D, research and development. There is nothing that will replace a man working at a bench and trying out a circuit. I don't think there is any question that our civilization is based upon theirs. I even saw chairs that were very similar in operation to the Montauk chair. The chief scientist was my primary guide, although there were others as well. They taught me about their star system and cultural inclinations. There are 6 planets within the star cluster known as the Pleiades, and they make up the society I will refer to as the Pleiades. 3 of these worlds are very much like us in the physical world of development. Arion is the philosophical and religious center. Alderaan is the technical center where science projects and manufacturing takes place. Aldebaran is the name of the planet that contains the center of defense. This is the group that fights their wars and is somewhat of a splinter group from the rest of the Pleiadian culture. They are very protective of their fellow Pleiadians, sometimes too much so. The other 3 planets that make up Pleiadian society are not populated at all with human-type beings. The beings on these planets are pure energy. On one of these 3 planets is the non-physical High Council. These are the 12 super beings that rule the Pleiadian culture. Each of the 12 have an equal say. They literally have the good of everybody at heart and might be identified in our culture as angels. None of the Pleiadian beings question the council or fight with them. It is unheard of. You can understand this easier if you realize that I have yet to hear of a decision made by the council that was not a proper decision. I am talking about a harmonious free society that we would consider to be a utopia. The main reason they have achieved this evolved state is that they developed a collective consciousness which links them all together. This link manifests in the individual minds of the Pleiadians as a voice that can be conversed with. It is not a cacophony of voices, nor does it give orders or seek to control a person. It is more like a companion or advisor. In this manner, each Pleiadian has a piece of the collective consciousness while retaining their own individuality. If mankind was linked in such a manner, I do not believe that there would be any war or crime on Earth. We actually already have this faculty, but it is a subconscious link which we are not aware of on a conscious level. I know it is there because I have personally developed a link to the human Earth consciousness, but I do not hear a voice as I do in the case of the Pleiadian consciousness. If we fully develop this faculty, it would probably appear as a voice. The Pleiadian voice usually just gives me advice or tells me where to find answers to different questions. At times, I can become very exasperated with the voice because it won't answer direct questions but only tells me where to find answers. According to what I learned, the history of the Pleiadian civilization goes back into antiquity. It is over 100,000 Earth years old and originates from what they refer to as the Old Universe. They came through a barrier and entered this part of our galaxy. They settled amongst the 7 sister stars which we call the Pleiades on our star maps. They are quite positive that they were a settlement that did not originate in this galaxy. Their definition of the Old Universe is somewhat vague. It is something like the universe that the Creator originally created and loosely parallels the Star Wars saga by George Lucas. The Old Universe was very much like this one. There were problems with it, so we created our own universe, this physical universe, and came through barriers as we entered. None of this is really too clear, and recollections of it are like a genetic memory. Many people pick up on the Old Universe in their dreams. The Pleiadians said they believed in a creator. Any being with a piece of the creator, we would call this piece the soul, is a son of the creator. They said that Christ was a projection from the collective subconscious of our planet. This is the aspect of us that connects us to the Creator. Christ appeared on earth in the spirit of kicking us in the butt to get us going with the Creator again. I do not know the entire agenda of the Pleiadians. From what I can figure out, it seems to be twofold. First, they want to help us here on Earth because they believe a very key step in the evolution of this galaxy starts on this planet. They also like to see things take a natural course because they are supernaturalists. Their other agenda is anthropological in that their interest is motivated by their belief that we are experiencing today what they went through hundreds of thousands of years ago. Their civilization started out much like ours, and they are gaining insights by studying us and other similar groups in the galaxy. The Pleiadian philosophy is very simple. They act with a non-interference directive, with everybody and anybody, including themselves. They are designed to be a totally free society. What I mean here is that each individual is encouraged to pick up a mission or job. As long as that job fits in and is productive for the society, the individual is provided for. In the Pleiades, there is no crime as we know it. Being part of a collective consciousness, any crime perpetrated would be against themselves. As long as they are part of the collective and subscribe to the philosophies of the collective, they don't have any crime per se. The only real crime a Pleiadian can commit, and certainly the biggest one, is to interfere with another person or civilization. I cannot stress how much they believe in this principle. If there is an interference, the penalty is death. The Pleiadians believe this to be not only a physical death but a spiritual one too. They are very strict on this point. The above reasoning is why the Pleiadians stock planets with representatives by utilizing the natives on the planet concerned. They make contacts and communicate with the various beings. If these beings agree with the Pleiadian philosophy, they will act as ambassadors. I believe that I am one of these ambassadors, and I am quick to add that there are thousands of us. We are virtually unknown but are injecting the planet with an unknown, to most sources, but very peaceful influence. This is why we don't condone any sort of violence or terrorist acts. We don't even condone any civil disobedience. Of course, it must be remembered that we are humans as well as Pleiadians and therefore can't be held 100% accountable to this ideal. I must point out that while I believe I am an ambassador for the Pleiadians and their agenda seems to be peace and love, I do not have a complete knowledge of the entire circumstances. My Pleiadian contacts have not given me any cause to disbelieve them, but it is not necessarily my prerogative to give them a full endorsement without critical analysis. For example, they believe they were the ones who originally colonized this planet, but others will debate that it was done first by Marduk or Orion. I think these various groups all established colonies here at about the same general time period. Others will also be suspicious of the Pleiadians because of their supposed involvement with Hitler and the Third Reich. This is standard fodder in ufology, so should be commented on. According to my contacts, Hitler was told to preserve the Aryan, same as Pleiadian, seed here on Earth. He was not supposed to kill off the seed of the Pleiadians' arch-enemies, the Draco, who colonized Earth in the form of the Semitic race. His mission was to protect the Aryans from the Semites and make an Aryan country for those who wanted to come and live in an exclusive Aryan environment. Of course, a lot of concepts and signals got crossed. Hitler did not pursue his mission and went off the rails, to say the least. As I said earlier, the agenda of the Pleiadians seems to be peace and love. I believe this also includes the process of education. We have to retain our own discernment and not fall into the belief systems that mind control organizations try to foster upon civilization. I must therefore embrace my own Pleiadian contacts as bizarre but positive phenomena which cannot be denied or ignored. I have seriously examined this phenomena since I was 25 and sought out objective points of view. The most convincing corroboration that these contacts were real came in about 1991. One day, I received a call from somebody who told me to go to the Gardiner Manor shopping mall at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I made the trip to the mall, walked in and everything was fine. The lights were on and a number of people were in the shopping mall. As I stepped from the entrance corridor to the main corridor, it was as if I had walked through a wall. Suddenly, the mall became dark. The lights were off and there was virtually no one in the mall. I felt as if time had jumped. I walked around and tried to figure out what was going on. I soon found a guard and exchanged greetings with him. The clock indicated it was 3 in the morning. I then saw a lighted corridor that went in the opposite direction from the entrance. I now remembered that I had been directed to go down this corridor in the original phone call I had received. Going down that corridor, I found 3 men who were supposed to be Pleiadian contacts. Afterwards, I wrote a message on a piece of paper for my own benefit that read, "I was here at 3 a.m. I then stashed it in a potted plant in hopes of retrieving it later and verifying my experience. The memories are somewhat hazy, but I ended up having Pleiadian contacts or dreams that evening. Upon waking the next morning, I recalled some of the experiences and decided I would return to the mall and try and find the note I'd left in the potted plant. Upon entering the mall, I noticed the same security guard and spoke to him. He remembered me and relayed that he should have challenged me for being at the mall after closing hours, but for some reason he didn't bother me. Something had apparently affected his mood or behavior. It wasn't long before I got to the potted plant and found the note I had left for myself. All of this verified to me beyond the shadow of a doubt that some contacts of a paranormal sort had taken place. It wasn't an hallucination. As far as I am concerned and based upon the experiences I have relayed to you in this book, the contacts I have had with the Pleiadians are real. Chapter 13, Aliens. Although my contacts to the aliens are through the Pleiadians, it does not mean that we should advocate their consciousness only. There are plenty of other creatures on the scene, and in the interest of education, I will inform you what I know of the different alien races involved in our planet. My information is based upon my contacts with the Pleiadians, my own personal experiences plus what I have absorbed from my contacts in the defense industry. There are all types of alien life, beginning with the lower-order life forms on other planets. Obviously, a low-order form of life will not build a spaceship or even a car. In order to build something, a life form has to be able to conceptualize. This takes a being of a very high order. In discussing aliens, I am not going to consider the lower-order life forms on other planets. The aliens we are interested in are the ones that can accomplish space travel in order to visit the Earth and elsewhere. Assembling a spaceship requires a being of a very high order with a complex dynamic function, sometimes called the quantum dynamic function, which is commonly called the soul. In common terms, a soul is a being with enough of a dynamic function burned into the spacetime continuum to have a consciousness. This means that you yourself are a quantum dynamic function and are partially composed of chaos or, if you prefer, random probability and unpredictability. In computer terms, a soul refers to a self-sustaining software program that can receive, send, process and originate information. We can therefore rule out the lower order of plants, animals, and insects which primarily respond only to instinct or programming. The aliens we will be looking at will have to have a consciousness and soul or soul-like consciousness that can reason, deduct and generate its own programming. There are a number of different types of aliens, but the most common form derives from the mammalian or animal world. These are human beings or human-like beings that are based upon the animal life from different planets. These types of aliens will come from a world somewhat similar to Earth in that it will require the same type of fauna and environment required to support animal life. The animals from one planet to another will have common similarities, although there will be differences as well. A dog on another planet may look a little different, but it will most likely have the same biological status that a dog on Earth has. Besides mammals, you will also find microbes, plant, insect, and reptilian life that are all carbon-based, as is all life on Earth. The reason that Earth-type planets, which contain life that is carbon-based, are the most common is that carbon, oxygen and hydrogen interact with each other more easily than do other elements. To go into ammonia and nitrogen requires a more difficult molecular structure that is not as conducive to evolution. It is for this reason that most life, including alien life, is carbon or hydrocarbon-based. The geometry of the molecules makes a better fit. All of this means that the most common forms of alien life will be animal-like human beings. Pleiadians are animal or human-based. Their genetic code is similar to that of monkeys. The K group or Crundeshan, asterisk as I believe they are called, are also human-based. In fact, they are so human that they are bald. If you put a hairpiece on one, they can pass for a human. While they are similar in height to us, the Pleiadians are much taller. There are many more groups within our galaxy which are human-like. This can include life forms such as cat people, dog people or bear people. These would all fall into the category of mammalian because their genetic base is not that far off from that of a human or simian form. The name Crundeshan was channeled by Duncan Cameron. In addition to the mammalians, you will have reptilian-like beings as well as insectoids. Most of these life forms appear to be bipedal and humanoid. Some of them may have extra arms or legs, but 2 legs and 2 arms with a torso seems to be the most common and efficient form of life. It mostly has to do with the practical factors of evolution. There are, of course, various mutations and variations that will pop up from time to time. The most common type of reptilian looks like a cross between an alligator and human. One can get an idea of what this type of reptilian looks like by viewing an old Star Trek show where a creature called a Gorn fought Captain Kirk at the insistence of a group of other beings called Metrons. Revealing themselves at the end of the episode, the Metrons looked very much like the Pleiadians I have described except that they were shorter. Hollywood has always had an uncanny ability to tap into the collective subconscious of man, and this is apparently just one more example. Reptilians such as the Gorn are relatively common in our galaxy, although not all of them have such a big snout. Reptilians are typically slow but very strong and usually at odds with the humans and/or Pleiadians. They have tremendous psychic abilities and can hypnotize people simply by looking at them. After mammalians and reptilians, the most common form of alien life are the insectoids. The most often encountered form of insectoids are the greys, which are actually a crossbreeding of insects with the reptilians. The greys have the traits of reptilians in their eyes, but their skeletons frame the outside of their body, referred to as exoskeletons. Reptilians and mammalians have an inner skeleton. There is a famous videotape that shows what appears to be a sort of grey-like being dying. The creature is literally thrashing around in an extremely fast manner. Isolating the video frames, one can see that the thing is turning within 1/30th of a second. Neither reptilians nor mammals move that fast, but most insect creatures can. The greys also have the hypnotic powers of the reptilians but often serve in subjugation to them. The greys are not the only insectoid race, but they are the most popular in current ufology. There is also an alien that looks very much like a 6 to 7 foot tall praying mantis. These aliens are very loving and foster healing. They are not warlike at all. Other types of aliens include winged humanoids or bird people. These really come under the heading of reptilian because birds are zoologically considered to be reptilians, although they are warm-blooded. Most intelligent reptilian life forms are warm-blooded because the cold-blooded reptilians are not as advanced. There is also a 4th class of alien life that has been theorized. This is an intelligent plant with a cellulose base. I have never heard any reports of this type of life form, but it remains a possibility. There are also the non-physical beings of pure intelligence which I referred to in my discussion of the Pleiadians. They also act as high council and promote the group consciousness that extends throughout the Pleiadian culture. The reptilians and other advanced life forms likewise have a group consciousness. This faculty seems to be a stage of evolutionary development which ties all the bio-netware of a particular race together. Those mentioned above are not the only aliens in the universe, but they are the ones I am familiar with and are also the basic types of life in the galaxy. Next, we will look at how they have colonized Earth. Chapter 14, Colonization. From what I've been told, the Pleiadians did the first genetic engineering of apes into human beings and established the original settlement on Earth. Humans are so close genetically to Pleiadians that they can crossbreed with them without any problems. In fact, we are so close to the Pleiadians that all humans today are probably derived from them. Other races of beings have also stepped in and have genetically engineered the original seed of man to be closer to their own genetic structure. The Caucasian or Aryan races would be the original race fostered by the Pleiadian consciousness. The Oriental race is rumored to be a genetic alteration of the Pleiadians by the Greys insectoid. This could explain why Orientals have slanted eyes and have a worker bee mentality. All of this information is supposition based upon suggestions and informed sources. It should not offend anyone and is not meant to do so. The next race to appear were the Abernash. They came from the planet Marduk as cited by Sitchin in The 12th Planet. They were supposedly a white race that genetically engineered the black race. The purest black race on Earth were known as the Nubians and are considered to be natives of this planet. Their genetic structure was crossed with the Pleiadians to give us the black race that we know today. Marduk was also known as Nemesis or Bête Noire in French, meaning black beast. The reptilians from Orion took the Pleiadian seed race and modified it to create the Semitic race. This explains why the Aryan race is sometimes called the master race. The theory is that it was the original blueprint which was doctored to fit the agenda of a particular life form. In addition to the above races, there is also the Native American race. Although most of their legends indicate they come from the Pleiades, this is not actually correct. Their identification with the Pleiades comes from the cultural influence of Atlantis, which was a Pleiadian settlement and the most recent ruling power in their history. The Native Americans are believed to have derived from a being that looked very human but was red-haired and red-bearded and came from the Andromedan galaxy. If you take the above four races and interbreed them, you will have the brown race, which can be considered a mixture of Caucasians, blacks and Orientals or some combination thereof. There are other possibilities as well. Please understand that I am not saying that any one race is more or less intelligent than the others. I am just trying to demonstrate how different alien beings have intervened with mankind to produce the different races of man and the cultural melting pot we have on Earth. The Keys of Enoch by J.J. Hurtak indicates that our planet ties its roots to the Elohim, which traces back to the Orion and Pleiadian constellations. I believe this is correct because most of the interference in our history has come out of that sector. This gives a general outline of how the Earth has been colonized. We will now look at some of the motivations and orientations of the different alien groups. Chapter 15, Alien Confederations. In our galaxy, we have three groups or confederations. The terms I will use to describe them were originally channeled by Duncan Cameron from his information source. These groups are the Nevarans, the Galactic Confederation, and the Levarans. The Nevaran group is really just a name for the Pleiadian Confederation, which we have already discussed. Sometimes considered to be the good guys, they have a strict non-interference directive. The Galactic Confederation parallels the United Nations we have on this planet. It consists of many different groups that got together and formed a confederation of planets. They are pretty much neutral and also have a non-interference directive which is derived from the Pleiadian Confederation or Nevarans but is not as severe. While the Galactic Confederation has a code which allows them to interfere to maintain balance or save one of their own, the Pleiadian non-interference code is absolutely unconditional. Even if the Pleiadians lose a battlecruiser on this planet, they are forbidden from blowing a city away in order to retrieve their cruiser. They would most likely send operatives to destroy the craft and keep it out of other hands. The third group is the Levarans. Duncan actually channeled a long and complicated spelling, but I use the simple phonetic spelling, Levaran. The word, Leviathan, which can be etymologically traced to the word, snake, derived from this group called the Leverins. They represent the archetype of a devil or super-negative being. This is the negative side. They will step on people in order to get what they want and enforce the idea that the end justifies the means. The Leverin alliance consists of reptilians and greys, and their leader is from a planet called Draco, which orbits Draco Major in the Orion constellation. That is why the Leverins are sometimes referred to as the Orion Alliance. There is also a group of Pleiadians who tie into the Orion Alliance. They are rebels and fighters, but they are fiercely protective of their other fellow Pleiadians. There are actually three groups of Pleiadians. First are the Aryan Pleiadians, which is where the term Aryan came from. They are philosophers, thinkers and dreamers. Some of them will not fight under any circumstances. The Alderan Pleiadians are doers. They also think well but are oriented towards doing things. This name is also used in the Star Wars movie. They are sort of in between the Aryan philosophers and soldiers, which comprise the third group, the Aldebaran Pleiadians. These are commonly called the negative Pleiadians. They are the ones who contacted Hitler and sent him off to protect and foster the Aryan race. They thought they were protecting their brothers and have been known to take their concerns to extremes. Although the Aldebarans are Pleiadians, they align more with the Orion group. They do not religiously follow the non-interference code of the other Pleiadians and might come to this planet to rescue a Pleiadian from one of the other two groups. I don't know how the Draconians are set up, but there are at least 3 different versions of them. Some of the Draconian Alliance even appear to be quite human. They are not all reptilian or insectoid in appearance. With the different agendas that have been referred to, it is obvious that there is conflict in the universe. There is the Pleiadian Alliance, which wants no interference of any kind. Then, there is the Galactic Confederation, which wants conditional interference. Finally, there is the Leverins or Orions, who require major interference and want to run the entire show and annex Earth to the Draconian Empire. All of this results in the basic strife we see here, the battle for planet Earth. This weaves its way most subtly into the entire cultural fabric of society. It includes the air we breathe, the food we eat, the vehicles we drive, the money we use, the shows we watch, the music we listen to, the politicians we vote for, and just about everything else. In simple terms, life on Earth is not left to itself and allowed to evolve on its own terms. There is interference and meddling. One group is seeking control over another, and some will not stop at the prospect of using forceful means to accomplish their ends. This brings us to the most sinister way to subjugate the population of Earth: abduction and implants. Chapter 16, Abductions. Most abductions can be classified into one of 2 groups, alien or government. First, I should clarify that when I say government, I am not referring to our duly elected officials but a secretive and mysterious Illuminati sort of group that functions through all arms of society. Through their own means of conscious and malicious controls over the minds of others, this group infiltrates all levels of the culture but concentrates on power points such as the military, major corporations, and all spheres of influence including the government. It is interesting to point out that quite a few television programs in the mid-1990s have reported on the alien abduction phenomena. It gives one the impression that the truth is coming to the surface. There is a good reason that alien abductions have been given so much airplay. The government does their own abductions and wants you to believe it is all coming from outer space. This sort of charade goes even deeper. Many people who begin to recall the surface memories of actual government abductions instead think they are recalling an alien encounter. A surface memory has been placed over the deeper memory, so you'll think you were abducted by aliens instead of the government. It is most convenient for the government to blame all abductions on aliens. According to some estimates, the government is accountable for most abductions, with the Greys being responsible for approximately 20 to 30%. Under the category of aliens, we have 3 classes of abductions: physical, astral and induction. Physical abductions refer to literally taking someone physically, putting them on a table and doing whatever is to be done with them. Astral abductions refer to taking the being or astral soul out of the body and manipulating such by electronic or more subtle means. Induction is when someone astrally enters the realm of another being and goes to work. If this type of manipulation is done on you, it might be something you are not even aware of. Many abductees report being literally pulled through the walls of their house. This is usually a physical abduction because the aliens have technology capable of making you weightless and massless so that you can be pulled through a wall. This can also be an astral phenomena, but my research indicates it is usually physical. Physical abductions usually include the removing of sexual samples. In females, they will usually take out an ovum or egg. In males, they will remove sperm cells. Aliens have also been known to take a biopsy of a testicle in the male or the ovaries in the female. In this case, they cut the skin behind the scrotum and remove the testicles by pulling them out of the sac. There is actually enough tube so that it can be shown to the patient. After hearing this report, I checked with a medical doctor who informed me there is about 40 feet of tube within the scrotum. The sperm cells are actually stored in the tube between the testicles and the prostate gland. Although these reports are primarily based on regressions, there is nothing biologically impossible about the descriptions. In all of these cases, the aliens are definitely taking procreative genetic samplings. This sort of operation could perhaps explain the phenomena I spoke of earlier with regard to von Neumann having an extremely large scrotum. There are also operations where samples are taken from the stomach lining of either the male or the female. A big needle is inserted in the navel and a biopsy is taken. If one can obtain what are called the stem cells or primary cells, then one can actually clone the body. These stem cells carry the whole DNA in its primary form. Geneticists are beginning to realize that as primary cells differentiate and replicate into secondary cells, the DNA changes. These primary or stem cells are most commonly found in the stomach, mouth, anal area and other portions of the body which interface with the outside world. The gonadal cells such as the testes or ovaries are also primary cells. They carry the entire genetic code of the organism. All of this suggests that the physical abductions done by the aliens are some sort of genetic research. As so many abductees report having been shown offspring that were half alien and half human, there is really no question someone is attempting to crossbreed the alien genetics with human genetics. One possible reason for this is that the alien race is very old and dying. Over time, their genetics have either atrophied, or become distorted to the point where they are now trying to regain the youthful genetics of our race. It is as if they are doing damage control by combining our genes with theirs. All of this suggests that any aliens engaging in such activity have a similar genetic base to ours. Many female abductees remember copulating with a male space person or alien. In these cases, the aliens let the fetus grow for 2 months, some people say 3, whereupon the female is abducted again with the fetus being removed. In these cases, the woman discovers that she is pregnant but has no idea how she became so. 2 months later, the pregnancy disappears. These reports are very common from female abductees around the country. There are at least 2 possibilities that could have happened in these cases. One is actual fertilization by the alien male as mentioned above. The other alternative possibility is that the initial sampling of the woman is fertilized in a test tube with alien DNA and then placed into the woman's womb for a couple of months. The woman is then abducted again, the fetus being removed as it is now old enough to incubate. It then grows into whatever it is going to be. This latter possibility is corroborated by reports that describe beings that are partially human and partially another life form such as plant-like, reptilian or whatever. Genetic sampling and breeding is not the only purpose of physical abductions. Aliens also do implantation. Sometimes it is a simple matter of putting in a transponder, which is in reality a transceiver, a device which both transmits and receives. This receiver is tuned to a certain frequency and is keyed to recognize a certain code. When that code is received by the transponder, it triggers a transmission which enables the aliens to locate you so that they can abduct you again. They have to have a system. If they are taking a woman, implanting her with a fetus and then removing the fetus 2 months later, they have to be able to find that woman when they want. If they are taking genetic samples from men, they have to do the same. In the case of male abductions, semen samples are taken with regularity and not just once. One abductee who underwent therapy to have his abductions stopped was successful in that regard but ended up with a disease caused by excess sperm cells. He was so used to having his seminal tube between the testicles and prostate being cleared out by the aliens that he had never masturbated. This build-up causes the sperm cells to rot after a while and he began to get infections in the scrotum. This was diagnosed by a doctor who taught him to clear his tubes from time to time. Most of the physical abductions are genetic examinations or implantations of some sort. This includes conditioning and programming as well. The implants themselves are usually surgically inserted in the body. They are not simply shot in with a syringe or cruder means. Scars can be found, but they are very, very thin and are disguised so that you won't find them unless you know what you are looking for. Age lines can masquerade as implant scars. More obvious ones are scoop marks found on the arms, legs or anywhere else on the body. Sometimes a thin thread-like mark will be found along the spine or near the sexual organs. Most of the physical abductions are performed by the gray aliens or government. The government performs all sorts of clandestine medical research through their abductions and then blames it on the aliens. I'm not saying the aliens are good or bad, but it is obvious we are looking at two different agendas when it comes to this subject. The prospect of alien agendas, as we have already discussed, are quite disturbing, but the government's agenda sounds even more frightening. While the government does take some blood samples and whatnot, genetic research has not traditionally been their main area of study. They are primarily into medical research, which includes conditioning, implanting and physical implants, silicon chipsets. If you hypnotize a typical abductee, you will soon come to the aliens. This is surface memory. If you take the abductee deeper into the subconscious by using other routines, all of a sudden the aliens will become human beings. They will usually be attired in a recognizable military uniform. There is no conceivable reason that the aliens would implant a memory so deep into the subconscious. If they wanted us to think their abductions were conducted by the military, they would put the false memory of the human abductions in the upper subconscious and not the lower subconscious. There are two levels of technology used for physical abductions. Many times, the aliens will literally take a human out of their car. We know that the person was actually taken out of the car because upon their return, they find themselves in another location and have to retrieve their car. In these cases, a technology is employed where the human is teleported to and from the spaceship. As they reach or leave a particular destination, they may float along in space before coming to a full stop. The second technology is the government just coming and grabbing or kidnapping someone. If anyone else is in the house, they will be put into an unconscious state. Aliens will also put out people that they don't want, but these instances usually turn out to be government abductions. There are many programs administered under the heading of government abductions. One of the major programs is the abduction of children to program them and then have them develop into a sort of super-secret army force that will activate in the event of national chaos. They are programmed to carry out the agenda of the powers that be, which will fluctuate from time to time but will ultimately be concerned with control. This physical programming by the government is administered with an electroshock system that is very similar to the electroshock machine used in insane asylums. A particularly effective technique they employ will literally electrically stimulate the person to the height of sexuality. Once the subject is excited to the highest point, just before ejaculation in the male and just before the contraction of the vaginal walls in the female, they suspend the state so the person's consciousness and physicality is suspended in an orgasmic state. The mind is in suspension and is technically quite wide open. At that point, all they have to do is pick up a block of memory and put it in. The technology has been developed to where almost any agent can do it. The electroshocking of the person is computer-run and the program is put on a floppy disk which can then be placed into a portable computer. With this advance in technology, the only other thing an agent needs is a diagram to wire the subject up. The agent first subdues the victim in one fashion or another. He then wires him or her up, boots up the computer, puts in the floppy disk and runs the program. The method of moving one block of memory to another and hiding memories is all canned. They also implant thoughts into different sections of the mind. Each time the subject goes into a sexual state, the thought is being programmed through the whole being. Such people are usually programmed to have sex so as to keep the implant active. People who have been sexually programmed in the above manner also transmit whatever information was programmed into them whenever they go into a sexual state. Sexual ecstasy is a rather magnetic and hypnotic state, and it is said to contain magic. In such a state, one partner can transmit to the other according to what was programmed. One can even be subconsciously indoctrinated to control their copulation to the point where they can transmit to the partner without either party being aware of what is going on. A mind meld occurs. Some young men are programmed to such a degree that they can miraculously arouse tremendous desire in a woman. If the programmers want a program spread around, such young men sow their seed around with the programming of the women concerned being the target. In this manner, an idea or program can be inserted into the society on a wholesale basis. It could be as simple a program as, buy ABC detergent, vote for this politician, or it could be considerably more complex. In some of these men, the magnetism is working overtime to where they can copulate 2 or 3 times a day, sometimes with more than one woman. These men are like incubuses and can have quite a devastating, even if romantic, effect on females. My estimate is that about 10% of the male population under 30 have been programmed in this manner. Conditioning is related to programming, but it is a different procedure. The most common kind of conditioning also uses electroshock. 2 electrodes are placed on the sides of the subject's forehead and a picture is placed in front of him or her. The picture is designed to influence the person. Let's say they want to train people to hate the president. They will put the president's face on a screen and shock the subject. After a while, the person is going to react every time he sees a picture of the president or has him brought to mind. He will go into a panic and will learn to hate the president. Conditioning is also used to control a person's behavior. Let's say there is a particular response they don't want someone to have. They will take the subject and do something to trigger that response and then shock them at that exact point. Over time, the person will subconsciously do anything possible to avoid that response. Different and more complex circumstances can easily be conceived, but these are the basic principles of conditioning. The aliens don't have any need for conditioning. In fact, I have never heard of a true alien abduction where electroshock was used. They are not that crude. If they want to influence someone's mind, they have more sophisticated techniques such as astral programming. Astral programming is when they remove the spirit, astral being, or whatever you want to call it. We are talking about the essence of you that is not physical. All of us leave our body at night and astral travel. Some of us are more aware of it than others. Becoming aware in your dreams and actually assuming consciousness in that state is an ancient occult technique and is today popularly referred to as lucid dreaming. True astral travel is when you can leave your body, travel out to the environment and view objective situations and people. Some people can actually get solid enough in the astral plane to where they can appear in physical form. This principle is sometimes used to explain the resurrection of Christ. If one has fully developed this faculty, one can actually bilocate and accomplish tasks in another place. Just as aliens have the capability of taking us away physically, they can also take us out of our body and back to their ship. Astral abductions are actually energetic abductions. Aliens sometimes just want to sample our energy. They might want to sample our patterns or get a read out of our energy body since the last time we were abducted. They also might want to program us so that we will do and say what they want. Astral programming does work and is done all the time. It was and is used quite frequently at Montauk. Astral abductions can be mistaken for the physical abductions because there isn't much difference. Either the astral being is floating out of the body or the body has become weightless and is floating along with the aliens. If you want to know if something was done physically to your body, you can look for scoop marks. Pain is not a good measure because pain can be inflicted astrally. As the government is quite capable of doing physical abductions, they are also capable of working on the astral, but it is not the usual method of operation. They have a psi-core which can pull a person out of the body and have a psychic operator mind meld with an abductee and drain the mind of memories. As with the aliens, read-outs are done from the last abduction. This is how spies can be read out without even being aware they are spies. At night, a spy is abducted by the psi-corp. The mind meld is done and what the spy saw is known and recorded. If they want, they can also abduct the subject physically and do whatever they want. I will later discuss a class of implants that do the same thing, but implants are not capable of interrogating the memory. They can only transmit what our senses are picking up. There are also cases where the aliens and government work together. This is based upon the idea that we have some sort of treaty with the Greys from Rigel. The government hides behind this umbrella at every opportunity. Besides physical and astral abductions, there is also the third-class one referred to earlier as induction. This is where they go into your non-physical being and do their readouts and programming. This is different from the astral abductions in that they are coming into you instead of taking you away. I think this is done by a different alien group and one that is more advanced than the Greys. These aliens, probably the reptilians, are able to leave their body just as you are. They are not physical when they enter you and are advanced enough to know how to get into the being during a vulnerable state, cohabit the body with the host and do whatever their work is. The induction can last for seconds, hours or months and appears to be used for the same ends as the physical and astral abductions. To my knowledge, the government has not been successful with this technique. As some people might confuse induction with a walk-in, I want to clarify that phenomenon. A walk-in refers to a spirit coming into a body previously occupied by someone else. It usually happens after a trauma to the original host. Let's say someone was frightened to death and left the body over sheer fear. If the body is still operable, another being comes in and animates it even though it might have been clinically dead for a short while. This is known as a walk-in. Of course, the walk-in could have been generated by the spirit walking in. He could have frightened the original host because he wanted the body. A walk-in may occur in many other instances. Let's say Uncle Hector sexually molested Johnny when he was 7 years old. Johnny found it so terrible that he decided to leave instead of experiencing the molestation. Next thing you know, Johnny is gone. Before Uncle Hector realizes that the body is dead, another being steps in and takes over. The parents then notice tremendous changes in the child. Later on, the parents might find out that Uncle Hector was molesting the child and they chalk up the drastic change to be a result of the abuse. They never considered that Johnny is no longer Johnny but is now Billy. He rapidly learns to respond to the name Johnny and the life that goes with it. A shove-in, or a force-in, is yet a different phenomenon. This is where someone forcefully pulls a being out of a body and shoves in another spirit. While there are many elaborate scenarios that can be envisioned, these are the basics of alien and government implants to the best of my knowledge. I have also written more about this subject in my other books concerning the Montauk Project.